Chapter 434. After 200 years of pondering and deliberating, Qin Shi finally grasped the true meaning of the word void that his master once mentioned. What is void? It is the void and also the void. Seeing through the void and encompassing all things. Even if you haven't eaten pork, have you not seen a pig run? Qin Shi had long known the main characteristics of Dongshu stage cultivators. They can freely travel through the universe, make sumaru mustard bags, and even open up their own small plane in the void. Apart from that, the biggest characteristic of Dongshu stage cultivators is that they are full of energy. Dongshu stage cultivators have reached the peak of their ability to sense and use the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Therefore, even if they don't actively guide it, they can easily influence the spiritual energy of heaven and earth nearby. Therefore, when Dongshu stage cultivators fight, any technique they use will be much more powerful than before. More importantly, as long as there is spiritual energy of heaven and earth nearby, Dongshu stage cultivators will never face the predicament of being exhausted. Because the speed at which they breathe in and out spiritual energy is far more than the consumption of their techniques. Therefore, in theory, Dongshu stage cultivators will have the absolute advantage even if they are surrounded by countless Yuanying stage cultivators. If we use gaming terms to describe it, it would be, Yuanying stage cultivators can't even break through the defense, how can they hurt Dongshu stage cultivators? Of course, the above is all that Qin Shi can see. The significance of Dongshu stage is much more than that. Maybe the mysterious woman left too deep an impression on Qin Shi, so after ending the tortoise-like state, Qin Shi can no longer calm down. He can't help but think about the process of the woman's appearance. In a trance, Qin Shi suddenly understands why he can't see the woman's face or hear her voice. That's because the woman is not in the same plane as him. Everything that Qin Shi had seen before was merely a projection of the woman through countless small planes using her supreme magic power to appear in front of him. From the beginning to the end, the woman never really came to the dark space he was in. As for the terrifying aura that came after, Qin Shi has reason to suspect. The Great Terror was actually trying to find out the true reason why the woman projected herself into this world. However, the woman had used some unknown method to prevent the Great Terror from discovering his existence. That was how Qin Shi managed to survive. The two mysterious experts flashed past Qin Shi's eyes like comets, but they left an extremely deep impression on him. Qin Shi kept thinking about everything related to the mysterious woman. Purple flames and azure lightning. The mysterious woman had 9 chains. The Great Terror in the depths of the void, as well as his 200 years of contemplation and contemplation. All sorts of seemingly unrelated events converged together. Suddenly, Qin Shi understood. It was like playing the ice bucket challenge in the middle of winter. When a basin of ice water was poured over his head, he suddenly felt enlightened. The word void was too mysterious. It could be understood as both the void and nothingness. The former meant space while the latter meant matter. In the dark space, there was only space and no matter. The only matter was himself. Just like the sumaru mustard seed bag, this dark space seemed endless, but in fact it couldn't be any smaller. Since Qin Shi was in the dark space, then he was part of the space, so the space was infinitely large for him. But if he jumped out of the space and looked back at this dark space, how big could it be? It might be as big as the sun or as small as a speck of dust. But all of this, what did it have to do with him? He was no longer a reference object in it, but an observer outside of it. The sun might be big, but as long as he flew out of the solar system, the sun would become a tiny star. Everything was relative. Nothingness and the void. Space and matter. They seemed unrelated, but they were closely related. And this was obviously the so-called true meaning of the word void. Qin Shi understood the key, so what he had to do next was to put his thoughts into practice. So he closed his eyes again. This time there were no more distracting thoughts in his mind. Understanding and breaking through are two different things. So when Qin Shi opened his eyes again, another 100 years had passed. A full 300 years. Qin Shi had finally endured until this moment. Therefore, the moment he opened his eyes, the surging true essence suddenly surged out of his body, and then spread out in circles. But then, the true essence was like tentacles and was all pulled back by Qin Shi. He was looking for the law threads left behind by the mysterious woman. When people walked through the snow, they would leave a trail of footprints on the snow. Although Qin Shi understood the true meaning of the word void, but because there was no spiritual energy in this place, he had not truly broken through to the Dongshu stage. Right now, he could not use his own strength to forcefully break through the void, so he needed to find the door of light that the woman opened for him. The snow melted. The door of light also disappeared. But the law threads that connected the two worlds still existed. Unless the woman personally destroyed it, this thread would forever exist between the two worlds. And this is the first law of heaven and earth that a cultivator must grasp, and also the biggest difference between the Dongshu stage and the ascended stage. One end is connected to the world, the other end is connected to the dark space. She could only find this law thread at the moment, because he had once used this law thread to travel between the two worlds. Maybe when he breaks through again in the future he will suddenly realize, even in this empty dark space, there were countless densely packed law threads. Every single one of them led to a different place. She still could not open a new law thread by himself, so he could only rely on the woman's power. He searched and searched and searched. Finally, he found it. To Shi, this thread could not be any thinner. If he did not understand the true meaning of the word void, he would not be able to sense the existence of this thread in his life. Of course, the so-called thread was just a concept. It actually refers to a cultivator's understanding of the law of heaven and earth. This was the first time Shi came into contact with the law of heaven and earth. Thus, the moment he discovered this law thread, he was so excited that he started to tremble. Shi could no longer suppress his excitement, and immediately reached out to touch the thread. The moment his finger touched the law thread, a golden light shone. The spirit energy from the world kept pouring out from the golden light. A smile that had not appeared in a long time appeared on Shi's face. After that, he did not stay any longer, and directly turned into a ray of light and entered the golden light. The world. I'm back. Please remember the domain name of this book.com. The mobile version of the book.com. Chapter 435. Unlike the previous time, Shi used his own ability to traverse through the two realms. After he flew out of the golden light, he naturally had a deeper understanding of the law threads. Shi looked up and saw the same towering trees and lush vegetation on the floating island. The great sun-moon star array dispelled the darkness and brought light to the large world. Everything in front of him was the same as the last time he was here. There seemed to be no changes. But after Shi looked around the floating island, he suddenly realized that the great sun-moon star array in the sky, which seemed to only be used for illumination, faintly contained strange patterns that even he could not understand. After realizing that something was wrong, Shi was not in a hurry to find Yuhuan Qianzuan to settle the score. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the ground and looked up at the sky with a serious expression on his face as he observed. The last time he was here, he had not comprehended the true meaning of the word void, so he did not feel that there was anything special about this array. Now that he had comprehended the true meaning of the word void, and had even come into contact with the first law of heaven and earth, after careful observation, Shi suddenly realized that these patterns were not the array patterns that maintained the operation of the array, but a law thread that he had never come into contact with before. The sun-moon star array rotated in unison. 9 stars flew in the sky, 9 palaces in the sky. Shi looked at the bottom of the floating island thoughtfully. When he saw that the bottom of the floating island was still covered with stars, he suddenly had a guess. This array was not only used for illumination. That was because other than the many law threads above the floating island that guided the movement of the stars, there were also many law threads below the floating island that seemed to be there but not there. They were silent in the void, like a huge net hanging below the floating island group. If the 120,000 floating islands were considered as a whole, then this array was like 2 huge nets firmly sandwiching the islands in between. One net had the sun-moon star array hanging on it, called Heaven's Net. The other net was deposited in the void, called Earth's Net. After understanding the mystery, Shi guessed. This formation might be the final trump card left by the Grand Pure Divine Ancestor for Qiandu. Once Qiandu faced a life and death crisis, the formation could instantly turn into a murderous formation and wipe out all enemies for Qiandu. Oh, it seems to be very powerful? After confirming the dangers of the Great Formation, Shi was still in no hurry to kill his way to Dragon Head Peak. Instead, he randomly grabbed an unlucky fellow on the floating island. Just like the last time, he had a time frame of reference this time, so he quickly found out from the mouth of this unlucky guy, it had only been a month since the battle on Dragon Head Peak. In other words, although Shi had been in the dark space for 300 years, only a month had passed in the great world. If the previous 200 years were to be included, then from the time he opened the gate of heaven until now, a total of less than 2 months had passed. If Qiandu time was converted to Earth time, it should be about 16 months. December of 1 year. 1 year and 1 April. Nianyan was already more than 6 years old. Without him and Yingying to accompany her this year, he didn't know if this child's birthday was happy. Thinking of this, Qinshi's longing for her suddenly overflowed like the Yellow River, uncontrollable. So, he didn't delay any longer. After casually knocking that unlucky fellow unconscious and throwing him to the side, Qinshi directly sat cross-legged in the air. As he entered a meditative state, the spirit chi of heaven and earth within a radius of 1,000 miles suddenly surged toward him like a tsunami. Under Qinshi's intentional guidance, the spirit chi of heaven and earth suddenly gathered in one place, almost turning into an almost translucent, huge funnel visible to the naked eye. The violent surge of spirit chi set off a huge storm. The storm spread in all directions, instantly causing several large floating islands in the vicinity to tremble. Rumbling noises kept ringing out. The nearby floating islands seemed to have experienced an earthquake. Not only were the residents on the islands terrified, but even the birds and beasts on the islands were so frightened that they scattered and roared. The spirit chi funnel grew larger and larger, and in a short while, it covered all the floating islands within a radius of 100 miles. And the spirit chi on the floating islands covered by the funnel all rushed toward Bicker. The direction of the bickering was exactly where Qinshi was. He was using his own strength, draining the dragon veins of hundreds of floating islands. When the spirit chi of heaven and earth entered the body, there should be a refining process. However, Qinshi was like a large factory at this moment. As long as the spirit chi entered his body, after a few assembly lines of processing, it would completely become a part of his body. The spirit chi surged faster and faster, and the accumulation of vital essence also increased. Qinshi didn't hide his aura at all, so his aura was rising at a speed visible to the naked eye. The early stage of the soul formation realm, the middle stage, the late stage, and then the peak stage. Under such crazy pressure, in just a few breaths' time, the accumulation of vital essence in Qinshi's body had already reached the peak. And as the funnel continued to expand, Qinshi's aura also became stronger and stronger. In the face of such a powerful aura, the residents on the nearest islands couldn't even stand steadily. At this moment, he didn't hide the killing intent in his heart. This killing intent seemed to have substance, and in the end, it turned into an invisible long sword. It soared into the sky and cut through the clouds. The sword pointed to the dragon head peak. Bang, bang, bang. Hundreds of dragon drums sounded at the same time, and the dense drum sounds poured down like a rainstorm. At that moment, even the god generals on duty on the various islands were stunned. But then, they were like cats whose tails had been stepped on, and they couldn't help but let out a long cry. Enemy attack! Enemy attack! Enemy attack! In an instant, everyone was in a panic and the sky shook. Yuhuan Qianzuan was discussing something with the celestial venerables in the Emperor Hall. When they suddenly heard the warning of the 5 divine generals, a trace of surprise flashed across the faces of the celestial venerables. Since they were called the celestial venerables of the 10 directions, there were naturally 10 celestial venerables in Tiandu. Qinshi was lucky last time and just happened to arrive at Dragon Head Peak when the other celestial venerables were patrolling, so he only met the 3 celestial venerables, Yuhuan, Miao Fa and Xianzhen. But today was different. With Yuhuan Tianzuan as the leader, Yujiang, Taihua, Yinghua, and the other celestial venerables were all present at this moment. Therefore, after hearing the divine general's warning, Yuhuan Tianzuan's face darkened on the spot. It must be him. He was lucky enough to escape last time, and now he dares to come back? Does he really think there's no one in Tiandu? Before he finished speaking, Yuhuan Tianzuan summoned the Jade Huan glazed cup, and then suddenly turned into a ray of light, rushing towards the direction of the dragon drum. Seeing this, the 7 celestial venerables who had not experienced the battle on Dragon Head Peak couldn't help but look at each other in dismay. Was there a need to be so excited? Chapter 436. Other than Yu Huan, Miao Fa and Xianzhen, the other celestial venerables had never personally fought with Qinshi, so their understanding of Qinshi came from the battle recordings on the Shantian mirror. The 7 celestial venerables were very knowledgeable, so it was not difficult to discover through the battle recordings. Although Qinshi seemed ferocious at that time, using his own strength to forcefully deal with the siege of 3 Empyreans, during the fight, he had been in a passive state the entire time, basically without any extra strength to fight back. The 3 celestial venerables almost took away half of Qinshi's life, not to mention the 10 celestial venerables present. Therefore, after seeing Yuhuan Tianzuan so excited, the 7 celestial venerables could not help but feel a little puzzled. Looking at Yuhuan's aggressive manner, could it be that he had some personal grudge with that person? The 7 celestial venerables each had their own thoughts. As they pondered over the key points, they followed Miao Fa and Xianzhen to the direction of the dragon drum. The 10 celestial venerables going out to meet the enemy was a grand occasion in divine capital. They did not say that they were not allowed to watch the battle. Therefore, the spectators could no longer suppress the excitement in their hearts. As long as they could fly, they followed the footsteps of the 10 celestial venerables and rushed toward Chen Shi's location like a swarm of bees. For a moment, as long as the celestial venerables passed by the floating island, it was like a hornet's nest that was lit by a fire. In an instant, countless celestial venerables and above flew out. It had been a long time since the great world was so lively. Densely packed silhouettes continuously flew across the sky above the floating island like a swarm of locusts. The scene was even more shocking than the final battle in the movie Avatar. It had to be said that this troublemaker not only had a high cultivation, but also had courage that far surpassed ordinary people. As the saying goes, where there is life there is hope. As long as one's cultivation reached the golden core stage and above, one's life was more important than anything else. The cultivation of immortal cultivators was not easy to come by, so how could they so easily give it up for nothing? What was the difference between Chen Shi's current actions and courting death? In order to fight back, he sacrificed his life for nothing. How unwise was such an action? Many people could not help but feel sorry for Chen Shi from the bottom of their hearts. However, even more people were filled with excitement, hoping to witness the fall of a heavenly venerate with their own eyes. With Yuhuan Tianzuan in the lead, the immortal cultivators of the great world quickly arrived at the periphery of the floating islands. The funnel that looked like a canopy of clouds had now turned into a gigantic cloud vortex, enveloping almost all of the floating islands within 1,000 miles. As the heaven and earth spirit chi continuously flowed into the center of the funnel, the floating island enveloped by the funnel gradually lost its vitality. At this very moment, the cloud vortex above the floating islands was like a ferocious beast from ancient times. Apart from sucking dry all the dragon veins on the floating islands, it also cast a huge psychological shadow on the islanders. This mysterious man who dared to make an enemy of Tiandu had yet to show himself, but the invisible pressure coming from his body weighed down on everyone's hearts like a huge rock. A sense of despair gradually spread through the crowd. It was only after Yuhuan Tianzuan's roar that this huge rock finally fell. Arrogant thief. There's a path to heaven but you don't want to take it. There's no door to hell, but you insist on coming. Generals of Tiandu, listen to my order. Follow me and set up the soul-capturing formation. This time we must not let him escape. Yuhuan Tianzuan took the lead and led the 5 divine generals into the cloud vortex like a sharp arrow. His appearance was like a ray of light in the darkness, instantly clearing away the haze in everyone's hearts. The islanders raised their heads to look, and they could not help but reveal an excited expression as if they had just escaped death. In the end, Yuhuan Tianzuan was their spiritual leader. Unlike last time, Yuhuan Tianzuan did not care about his face this time and forced himself to fight Chen Shi one-on-one. Instead, he assumed a group fighting stance. However, when he rushed into the clouds, he suddenly realized that Chen Shi's aura seemed to be much stronger than last time. Thinking of this, Yuhuan Tianzuan's face could not help but flash a trace of surprise, and a sense of uneasiness arose in his heart. However, when Miaofa and Xianzhen arrived, this feeling of uneasiness was thrown out of his mind in the blink of an eye. He was just a defeated opponent. Could it be that he could pierce through the sky today? For safety reasons, Yuhuan Tianzuan did not recklessly rush in alone. He was afraid of falling into Chen Shi's ambush, so he immediately said to Miaofa and Xianzhen, "This person's behavior today is really strange. I'm afraid it's a trap. The two of you follow me to find out what's going on." Hearing this, Miaofa and Xianzhen immediately nodded, then summoned their magic weapons and rushed into the depths of the clouds with Yuhuan Tianzuan side by side. At the same time, Chen Shi, who was in the center of the vortex, slowly opened his eyes. As soon as he opened his eyes, the vortex formed by the spiritual energy above him began to rotate rapidly, and then poured down on him at a speed visible to the naked eye. There was no grand and unique scene of a breakthrough. When the vital essence in Chen Shi's body accumulated to a certain level, he who had mastered the true meaning of the word void, naturally broke through to the divine transformation stage, and then directly stepped into the Dongshu stage. The moment Chen Shi stepped into the Dongshu stage, a faint golden light suddenly lit up on his eyebrows. From afar, it was a bit like when Erlang Shin opened his heavenly eye in the TV series. Then this golden light gradually converged between Chen Shi's eyebrows, and then completely disappeared. This was the first law of heaven and earth that he had mastered, also known as the divine mark. Once the divine mark appeared, the Dongshu stage would appear. Qin Shi deliberately restrained his aura, so Yuhuan Tianzuan did not notice anything strange. When enemies meet, naturally their eyes would be exceptionally red. Even though they were still far away, the two sides did not even say a word. As the saying goes, my brother Long is ruthless and doesn't talk much. The moment he saw Qin Shi, Yuhuan Tianzuan viciously threw the jade-glazed cup in his hand at him. It was still the three lanterns of heaven, earth, and man. Seeing this, Qin Shi did not even condense the divine sword Dharma power. He directly formed a sword with his fingers, and then slashed at the three lanterns. It was still the first move of the moonlight sword technique. But after this sword slash, it instantly sucked away the little remaining spiritual qi in the surroundings, causing a strange vacuum to appear where the sword slash passed. This was the difference between the divine transformation stage and the Dongshu stage. If the divine transformation stage was compared to nitroglycerin, then the Dongshu stage was obviously nuclear fusion. There was a fundamental difference between the two. Therefore, the moment Qin Shi's sword slash hit the three lanterns of heaven, earth, and man, an explosion that was beyond everyone's imagination occurred. With a loud boom, the three lanterns were sent flying back. The three heavenly lords who were closely related to the three lanterns seemed to have been severely injured, and a strange flush appeared on their faces. Please remember the domain name of this book. 9 Heavens Divine Emperor Mobile Version website. Chapter 437. Above the floating islands. The huge cloud vortex obscured everyone's vision. They did not dare to approach the vortex, so they quietly floated around it. Looking up, the densely packed figures were like a swarm of locusts, almost covering half the sky. Just like the audience in the Colosseum in Rome, these descendants of ancient cultivators did not dare to make any noise, but there was still an inexplicable fanaticism in their eyes. Everyone wanted to witness the fall of a heavenly venerable with their own eyes. But no one expected that in addition to witnessing the fall of a heavenly venerable, they would also be fortunate enough to witness the birth of an ancient legend. With the arrival of the three heavenly venerables, Yuhuan, Mirofa, and Xianzhen, a gap was torn in the cloud vortex that covered the sky. The three heavenly venerables were like 3 sharp arrows with tricolored divine flames on them as they shot straight at the enemy in the depths of the vortex. For a moment, the golden myriad spirit ancient E, the purple sky incinerating purple flame, and the grayish-green netherworld ghost flame all bloomed with their own unique brilliance. The 3 flames intertwined and rose, burning fiercely, almost instantly burning away a large portion of the cloud vortex. At the same time, it also cleared the vision of the spectators. And it was precisely because of this clear vision that everyone witnessed what happened next with their own eyes. After the green sword light and the tricolored divine flame collided in the air, it was like a sharp sword piercing through a glass window. It strangely felt like a mirror shattering in the void. Boom. Following a huge explosion, a formless shockwave spread out. Wherever the shockwave went, spiritual energy surged and wreaked havoc. The spectators closer to the center of the battlefield felt as if their chests had been hit by a battering ram. They were actually sent flying by this invisible force just like that. All of you back off. Back off at least 5 kilometers. Divine generals of 5 directions, listen up. No one is allowed to come near this place. Fortunately, there were not only 3 heavenly venerables present today. The 7 heavenly venerables, including Yujiang, Taihua, and Yinghua who had arrived later, saw the intensity of the battle and simultaneously pulled up a protective barrier around the periphery, saving many people in time. Although it was only the first move, the intensity of this battle was far greater than the battle on Dragon Head Peak. Feeling the powerful true essence fluctuations, the 7 celestial venerables' faces suddenly flashed with a trace of surprise. It was no wonder that Yuhuan would put on such a solemn expression. If it was a one-on-one battle, it was likely that none of the 10 Empyreans present were his match. In a battle between experts, one move was enough to determine the truth. The 7 celestial venerables merely watched the battle from afar and did not personally step forward to fight with Qin Shi, so their feelings were naturally not as vivid as those of the 3 celestial venerables present. Qin Shi's seemingly casual slash, other than forcing the heaven, earth, and man lanterns to retreat, he had also directly injured the 3 celestial venerables who were related to the lives of the 3 lanterns. How could Yuhuan Tianzuan not be shocked? It wasn't like he hadn't fought with Qin Shi before. When he fought Qin Shi, who was at the peak of the soul formation stage, he didn't have the upper hand, but it wasn't as if he had no chance of winning. But now, Qin Shi was fighting against 3 celestial venerables alone, but he could still easily injure them. How was this possible? At this moment, not only was Yuhuan Tianzuan shocked, but even the 2 celestial venerables, Miao Fa and Xian Zhen, were filled with shock and uncertainty. The three of them hesitated, and the scene temporarily returned to its original calm. Seeing this, Qin Shi wasn't in a hurry. Instead, he slowly flew up until he was at the same height as the three celestial venerables. Only then did he speak loudly to everyone present. This humble one is Qin Shi. I've already met all of you before, so I don't think I need to introduce myself too much, right? Actually, I've always wanted to sit down and talk with all of you, but you didn't even give me a chance to speak. I originally had no intention of making an enemy out of Tiandu. I just wanted to borrow the sky-bearing impersonation technique and use the floating dawn mirror. If all of you are reasonable, you should understand that you shouldn't make an enemy out of me for no reason. At this point, Qin Shi suddenly paused. Then he looked at Yuhuan Tianzuan and said calmly, "Also, I want to clarify that I didn't kill Wuxia." After hearing this, a trace of doubt flashed across Yuhuan Tianzuan's face. He frowned and seemed to want to say something, but then he heard Qin Shi continue. "So what I want to say now is, if all of you are willing to talk, then I can give all of you another chance. Let's turn weapons of war into gifts of jade and silk so as to avoid increasing the sin of killing. If not, everyone please don't blame my sword for being merciless." Although Qin Shi wasn't an unforgiving evil person, he wasn't a good person with a gentle temperament either. If the mysterious woman hadn't saved him, he would have died with hatred in his heart. Therefore, although his words seemed reasonable, in reality, he didn't leave any face for the 10 celestial venerables. This was deliberately embarrassing for Tiandu. Of course, if the other party honestly lowered their heads and admitted their mistakes, Qin Shi could indeed consider letting them live. But, with the lofty status of the 10 celestial venerables, how could they easily lower their heads to others? What? Don't we, the 10 celestial venerables, need face? If they really agreed to Qin Shi's request today, then how would the 10 of them face the generals of Tiandu in the future? How would they continue to rule the outside world with the face? From the beginning, Qin Shi had already calculated the thoughts of the 10 celestial venerables. The reason why he wasted his breath was actually just to give himself a good reason to make a move so that he could be more decisive when he took action later. Speaking of which, Qin Shi was really a little mischievous, as expected. It would have been better if he hadn't said those words. After saying that, the 10 celestial venerables' expressions changed greatly. Among them, celestial venerable Sun Blaze, who had the most fiery temper, was so angry that he directly summoned his natal magic treasure, Heaven-Splitting Axe. After that, celestial venerable Sun Blaze ignored celestial venerable Yuzhang's obstruction and rushed toward Qin Shi with his giant axe. "Little thief, don't be so arrogant. Yuhuan, you guys watch on the sidelines for now. Let me deal with him alone." Yuhuan, Miaofa, and Xian Zhen couldn't gain any advantage over Qin Shi, but celestial venerable Sun Blaze didn't believe it. He raised his giant axe and fiercely chopped at Qin Shi. Axes were different from swords. They were designed to be heavy and powerful and must kill in one hit. Therefore, as celestial venerable Sun Blaze chopped down with his axe, a strong wind immediately blew in the air. In terms of power, it was even more ferocious than the three lanterns of heaven, earth, and man. This kind of fighting style that only focused on killing and disregarded defense was actually very rare among immortal cultivators. Celestial venerable Sun Blaze relied on the indomitable fierceness in his bones to fight for the position of celestial venerable. Therefore, even if his cultivation wasn't at the top of the 10 celestial venerables, not many people dared to casually fight with him. He was a living brute. But today this brute met an opponent who was even more reckless than him. "Come on." Seeing that the giant axe was about to arrive, Qin Shi's face suddenly flashed with a trace of excitement. He made a grabbing motion with his left hand, and a saber-like materialization weapon condensed in his hand. Then Qin Shi held the saber in his hand and directly faced the giant axe. Using strength to overcome strength. Using force to meet force. He wanted to take this opportunity to gauge the absolute power that he now possessed. Chapter 438. Just as Celestial Master Blazing Sun was wielding his heaven-splitting axe and using all his strength to execute the 36 moves of the Heavenly Dipper Axe technique, Qin Shi's mood could be accurately described with one idiom, and that was, elation at the sight of a prey. Different cultivation methods would naturally lead to different combat habits for immortal cultivators. Based on Qin Shi's previous combat style, when faced with such a ferocious cultivation technique, Qin Shi would definitely not meet it head-on. Instead, he would constantly twist and turn and restrain his opponent until he found a flaw in his opponent's aura. Only then would he decisively strike with his sword, hoping to achieve the desired result in one strike. The axe technique was ferocious, while the sword technique was nimble. Each of the 18 types of martial arts had their own unique characteristics. It was not easy to judge which one was better and which one was worse. It was also because of the characteristics of the axe technique that Celestial Master Blazing Sun's move was not necessarily exquisite. However, it was definitely incomparably violent. Even if Yu Huan and the others joined forces, they did not dare to meet it head-on. Of course, just because Yu Huan and the others did not dare to meet it head-on did not mean that Qin Shi did not dare to meet it head-on. This was his first battle after stepping into the insightful emptiness realm, so he naturally treated this battle as a testing ground for his sword. Therefore, Qin Shi abandoned the sword technique he was most proficient in and instead used the Red Sun Saber technique, which he had not used often before. He was prepared to meet Celestial Master Blazing Sun's axe head-on, hoping to see how much progress he had made. Therefore, the moment he raised his hand and swung his saber, Saber Chi was born, instantly cutting through the void and soaring into the sky. At the same time, the area within a radius of several hundred feet was shrouded in Saber Chi, as if it wanted to destroy everything within range. It was impossible to dodge and was at the mercy of others. And this was the third move of the Red Sun Saber technique. One saber cleaves the sky, one with the saber. Great clumsiness turned into simplicity, one saber was enough. As the heaven-splitting axe came crashing down, a bright saber light with a hint of coldness shot out from the tip of the saber. Then, with an incomparably violent and domineering aura, it slashed directly at the incoming Celestial Master Blazing Sunday. At this moment, almost all the spectators, including the 10 Celestial Masters, could not help but hold their breaths, for fear of missing any exciting scenes. However, what happened next disappointed them. For some unknown reason, the moment the tip of the saber touched the edge of the axe, the giant axe formed from Celestial Venerate Sun Blaze's true Yuan Qi melted like snow under the blazing sun and slowly dissipated into the void. This feeling was very strange. It was as if one side was holding a tempered steel knife, while the other side was holding an axe carved out of ice. Therefore, as soon as the two came into contact, the axe shattered into countless ice shards. Sigh. Seeing this, Qin Shi sighed silently. In the end, he still couldn't hold it in. After all, how could he, who had already grasped the laws of heaven and earth, be like before, only rely on the enormous amount of true essence to fight? If that was the case, wouldn't a Dongshu stage Xiaxianist become a brute with nothing but brute strength? In fact, the moment Heavenly Venerate Sun Blaze swung his axe, Qin Shi saw numerous law threads on his body. Therefore, he only needed to cut off one of them to easily neutralize Heavenly Sovereign Sun Blaze's attack. Until this moment, Qin Shi finally understood the gap between the Divine Transformation stage and the Dongshu stage. True Yuan was no longer the only standard to measure one's strength. Understanding and grasping the laws of heaven and earth was the direction he needed to study in the future. The more laws he grasped, the closer he was to the Great Tao. So, unknowingly he had already reached this step. Thinking of this, Qin Shi's excitement from his breakthrough immediately calmed down. When he turned his head to look at Yuhuan Tianzuan and the others again, there was only a pale feeling left in his heart. That was dull and uninteresting. So what if they were Tiandu? So what if they had more people? They were no longer on the same level. The reason was simple. It was like an adult fighting kindergarten children. Even if there were 100 children standing opposite him, he wouldn't feel any pleasure after destroying them. Punch at the Nanshan nursing home, kick at the Beihai kindergarten. This was just a joke. Perhaps this was the after effect of advancing to the next level. At this moment, in Qin Shi's eyes, this great world that carried all the hopes of the ancient cultivators was no different from the Beihai kindergarten. He silently looked around the room. Wherever he looked, the other party would reveal a nervous and somewhat flustered expression. It was just a casual slash. Heavenly Sovereign Sun Blaze, who was known for his martial prowess in the divine capital, was seriously injured. Now, he had been brought back to the Dragon Head Peak by the divine generals to heal. Seeing this, the remaining 9 heavenly sovereigns immediately took out their life magic treasures as if they were facing a great enemy. They were prepared for any possible attacks from Qin Shi. For a moment, there was a strange silence. When Qin Shi saw their laughable expressions, he couldn't help but think of the mysterious woman in the dark space. Perhaps in the eyes of that mysterious woman, he should be as insignificant and laughable as these people in front of him, right? The Great Tao was endless. There was always a mountain higher than another. If he didn't jump into this small pond, he would never know how high the sky was and how wide the earth was. Thinking of the realm that the mysterious woman might reach, even Qin Shi couldn't help but yearn for it. However, Yearning was yearning, reality was reality. The reality was, Ying was still waiting for him to save her. Nian was still waiting for him to go home. What were they waiting for? Therefore, after seeing the remaining 9 heavenly sovereigns take out their life magic treasures, Qin couldn't help but smile at them and say, "All of you come together, I'm in a hurry." As soon as his voice fell, a divine sword appeared in his right hand. Then, Qin held a sword in one hand and a saber in the other and took the initiative to rush toward the 10 heavenly sovereigns in front of him. "Don't be afraid. Everyone attack together. This old man really doesn't believe that he can overturn the heavens." Yuan Qinzuan was also a ruthless person. Although he didn't understand why Qin was able to defeat heavenly sovereign Yang Yan in one move, he didn't have any intention of retreating. Instead, when he saw Qin make a move, he took the lead to face him. It was still the same 3 lanterns of heaven, earth and man combined attack. But this time they were not facing Qin, who was at the peak of the semi-god realm. It was Qin, who was at the early stage of the void transformation realm and already had killing intent in his heart. "I've already given you a chance. It's you who didn't cherish it, then don't blame me for being ruthless." After saying that, Qin couldn't help but let out a long roar towards the sky, and the sword in his hand suddenly glowed with a faint cold light. The third move of the combination of sword and saber. The saber was formless, the sword was formless, and the vast expanse of heaven and earth could be shattered. Chapter 439. 3 styles of saber, 3 styles of sword. 3 styles of saber and sword. 3 styles of endless, 9 styles of returning to one. As soon as he finished speaking, Qin held the sword in his right hand and the saber in his left. With a shocking momentum, he charged toward the 10 celestial sages not far away. At this moment, one of the 10 celestial sages was injured. Although the remaining 9 were a little worried about the strength that Qin had shown before, after being provoked by Qin again and again, the 9 celestial sages were obviously completely provoked. "Evil thief, don't be so arrogant. This is the hinterland of Tiandu, under the shadow of the divine ancestor. How can you be so presumptuous? Everyone, let's take him down together." By Su Qingtian's order. As Yuan Qinzuan's words fell, the 9 of them no longer cared about their identity and almost simultaneously took out their famous natal magic treasures. As various magic treasures flew out of their hands, the field suddenly shone brilliantly, showing the mighty divine power. Seeing that the battle was about to start, even the 5 divine generals, whose strength was second only to the celestial sages, retreated 10 miles away at this moment, not daring to take half a step forward. After all, this was a battle of the celestial sages. It was also the first time that the 10 celestial sages had joined forces to deal with one person. Therefore, no matter the result, today's battle was enough to be called unprecedentedly brilliant. Perhaps it was to make this battle more legendary. The moment Qin raised the saber and sword in his hand, even time seemed to stop flowing, and everything in the void was silent. The third style of the divine skill, combination of saber and sword. The saber is formless, the sword is formless, the vast expanse shatters heaven and earth. When he was still in the heavenly jade world, Qin had already used this move. However, at that time he had not comprehended the true meaning of the word void, so he could only force the move with a huge amount of vital essence. At this moment, Qin finally stepped into the insightful void realm. Therefore, when he used this move again, he suddenly had a different feeling in his heart. It turned out that this move actually involved the application of the laws of heaven and earth, and could only be smoothly used by those above the insightful void realm. The saber is formless, the sword is formless. Its purpose was to shatter heaven and earth. Qin swung the sword and saber in his hand, and endless saber and sword chi burst out in the void. Aura fluctuations could not be concealed, so the celestial venerables immediately felt that there seemed to be thousands of swords slowly forming in front of him. However, when they focused their gazes, they did not find anything strange. That was because this move had chi but was formless. It was exactly the same as that sentence. The blade was formless and the sword was formless. The chi of the saber and sword, which contained the essence of the word void, was like a huge net in the void, suddenly covering the 9 celestial venerables. The 9 celestial venerables did not notice anything strange. Only when the net of chi from the saber and sword came crashing down did everyone realize that they had fallen into Qin's trap. There was almost no warning. It was as if they had stepped into a void, and there was no end to their surroundings. Yuan Qinzuan tried to struggle but found that he couldn't. It was as if he was trapped by something invisible. This? Seeing this, Yuan Qinzuan couldn't help but widen his eyes slightly. He quickly mobilized all the true chi in his body, trying to forcibly break free from the shackles. However, at this moment, his body suddenly felt pain, and countless bloody marks suddenly burst out all over his body. As if falling into a red dye vat, the 9 celestial venerables' clothes were instantly soaked with blood. Even with the protection of treasures, it was difficult for them to withstand the power of this move. Because this move was simply unpredictable and impossible to dodge. It was hidden in the void. If one did not comprehend the essence of the word void, it was basically impossible to detect it. And this was the terrifying part of the third divine skill. Turning nothingness into something, the world was filled with saber and sword chi, formless and formless. At this moment it was a flower. At that moment it was a bird. At the next moment, it was a scorching sun in the sky. From the perspective of a bystander, it was as if nothing had happened. However, the 9 celestial venerables' bodies were oozing blood very strangely. Just as everyone was feeling a little puzzled, Yuhuan Tianzuan suddenly looked up to the sky and let out a fierce howl. Then, he gritted his teeth and ignited a drop of blood essence in his body. One had to admit that this old man did have some eyesight. Once he saw that the situation was not right, he actually directly put on a desperate posture. At the price of burning his blood essence, he forcefully tore a gap in Qin Shi's saber and sword chi net. After escaping, Yuhuan Tianzuan did not waste any time. He directly recalled the Jade World glazed cup and then used the ancient spirit Yi to save the few celestial venerables beside him. Yuhuan Yu. Looking at Yuhuan Tianzuan, who was covered in blood chi, a trace of shock appeared on Heavenly Venerate Wondrous Spell's face. Hearing that, Yuhuan Tianzuan did not immediately reply. Instead, he looked at Qin Shi with eyes full of resentment. This person is not the same as before. He must have had some fortuitous encounter and stepped into the legendary supreme stage. This sentence was like a bucket of cold water poured over their heads, instantly extinguishing the burning battle intent in their hearts. Supreme stage. That was an existence that surpassed Empyreans. Ever since the Grand Pure Saint Ancestor passed away, the strength of the great world had begun to decline. It had been a long time since a supreme stage existence had appeared. Thinking of this, everyone couldn't help but look at each other. However, Yuhuan Tianzuan did not give them too much time to think. Instead, he continued, "This person is not from our Tiandu. He is an external enemy. If we avoid him, how will we have the face to worship the sacred ancestor in the future? Tiandu's 10,000 years of inheritance, the sacred ancestor's illustrious name, is it going to be destroyed in our hands today? This old man is unwilling and also unwilling. Only because I am one of the 10 Empyreans of Tiandu." These words were so beautiful that it was as if the 8 Empyreans present had been injected with chicken blood. Their faces immediately surged with boundless pride. That's right. So what if you're a sovereign? Since we are the 10 Empyreans of Tiandu, how can we easily lower our heads to others? This seemingly long and tedious conversation actually happened in the blink of an eye. Therefore, just as Qin Shi was about to deliver the final blow, the remaining 8 Empyreans actually ignited the blood essence in their bodies. In an instant, the true essence fluctuations caused by the 9 Empyreans burning their blood essence were like the setting sun dyeing a large area of the sky red. Seeing this, Qin Shi couldn't help but flash a trace of admiration on his face. Immortal cultivators couldn't lose their courage. He didn't expect that the 10 Empyreans had been in high positions for so many years, but the sword in their hearts hadn't rusted because of this. His opponent was so valiant, how could he fall behind? Therefore this time, Qin Shi didn't think of avoiding the spearhead at all. Instead, he immediately brandished his sword to meet it. At this point, the result of this battle was destined to be a fight to the death. Then the 10 Empyreans united and displayed all that they had learned in their lives. They charged towards the legendary supreme stage in their strongest state. And Qin Shi displayed the elegance of the void stage. With his own strength, he fought 9 soul formation stage cultivators who were burning their blood essence and risking their lives. This battle was unprecedentedly bright. Please remember the domain name of this book. 9 Heavens Divine Emperor Mobile Version Reading Website. Chapter 440. As the battle gradually reached its climax, earth-shattering explosions rang out one after another. The multicolored True Yuan was like an aurora, slowly flowing in the air above the floating island. As long as the true essence energy came into contact with Qin Shi's saber and sword chi net, it would explode with a blinding light. The scene was like magnesium powder meeting fire. Shockwaves would always follow the explosion. Wave after wave of shockwaves crashed into the nearby floating islands, causing the islands below to tremble violently. If not for the fact that both sides were virtuous enough to subconsciously carve out a few moves before making a move, countless floating islands would have already been smashed to pieces. This was a battle between heavenly venerables. Although it looked like a dazzling battle, it actually contained countless murderous intents. Thus, even from 5 kilometers away, the spectators could still feel an extremely powerful murderous intent. No one dared to take a step forward. As long as they came into contact with the saber and sword Chinet or the rainbow divine light, they would definitely be shredded into pieces. Almost everyone's hearts tightened, including the 10 heavenly venerables. Because there was a time limit to burning blood essence. Not only did Qin know this, but even the 9 heavenly venerables knew this very well. Time was of the essence, so the 9 of them wanted to use all their strength to defeat Qin in one fell swoop before the blood essence was completely burned. But how could Qin let them do as they wished so easily? Perhaps it was because heavenly venerable Sunblaze was absent, but the 10 directions immortal extermination formation that the 9 heavenly venerables had set up was clearly lacking in maturity. After grasping the true meaning of the word void, Qin could always immediately discover the flaws in the 9 heavenly venerables' joint attacks even if he didn't deliberately pay attention to them. Thus, the 9 heavenly venerables' joint attacks were always easily resolved by Qin. The 9 of them working together still couldn't hurt Qin. Once the blood essence was completely burned, what would they use to deal with him? At this thought, Yuhuan Tianzuan immediately became impatient. Even the frequency of his attacks became more and more hurried. However, being impatient wouldn't help at all. Instead, it would only expose his shortcomings even more quickly. After the two sides had exchanged more than 1,000 moves, Qin deliberately revealed a flaw and pretended to be pinned down by Emperor Yujiang. At the same time, he deliberately exposed his back to Emperor Yuhuan. Seeing this, Yuhuan Tianzuan fell for it. The old man felt that the opportunity was not to be missed, so he directly broke out of the formation and viciously smashed the glass cup at Qin's back. As the Jade Universe glazed cup flew out of his hand, the 10 directions immortal slaying formation, which had been greatly weakened due to celestial venerable Sunblaze's absence, immediately fell apart. At this time, Qin seemed to have expected this. He suddenly forced Wondrous Spell Heavenly Lord back with a slash of his saber. Then, he decisively pulled back his sword, allowing the sword that had been accumulating power for a long time to point directly at Yuhuan Tianzuan. Yuhuan Tianzuan only saw a cold light flash before his eyes. He didn't even have time to defend himself before the sword pierced through his protective aura and through his body, drawing a long line of blood in the air. Pooh! After suffering such a heavy blow, Yuhuan Tianzuan lost his ability to fight on the spot and instantly fell from the sky. If Heavenly Lord Yinghua hadn't reacted quickly and caught him in time, Yuhuan Tianzuan would have fallen directly into the endless void below. The formation has been broken. We are in danger. Everyone, quickly retreat to the Imperial Hall and regroup. We will wait for an opportunity. Go quickly. I will stop him. Heavenly Lord Wondrous Spell was indeed somewhat courageous. Seeing that the 10 directions immortal slaying formation had collapsed due to Yuhuan Tianzuan's injuries, he advanced instead of retreating. He held the 8 Views Palace lantern and brazenly faced Qin. However, Heavenly Lord Wondrous Spell, who was only at the early stage of soul formation, couldn't block Qin, who was at the early stage of void transformation, even if he burned his blood essence. Thus, in the instant that the other 7 people turned around and flew away with Yuhuan Tianzuan, Heavenly Lord Wondrous Spell, who was covering for them, was struck by Qin's sword. As a result, he fell from the sky and heavily smashed into the floating island below. 1,000-mile journey collapsed because of an ant's nest. Because of Yuhuan Tianzuan's momentary mistake, the 10 directions celestial lords were instantly defeated. In gaming terms, that would be, the configuration of their formation was too low and the margin for error was almost zero. A single mistake would instantly cause them to be wiped out. After Qin defeated Heavenly Lord Wondrous Spell, he didn't rush to finish him off. Instead, he immediately chased after the 8 fleeing celestial lords. Seeing this, Heavenly Lord Yujiang, who was the strongest among them, decisively stepped forward and replaced Heavenly Lord Wondrous Spell to cover for everyone. However, Qin was like a madman who had gone berserk. As soon as the two of them met, Heavenly Lord Yujiang was slashed down by his sword and fell straight into the void below. Wondrous Spell and Yujiang fell one after another. Even if they excluded the heavily injured Yuhuan, there were still 6 people left. Thus, Heavenly Lord Xuanzhen stepped forward. They couldn't delay for too long, but this method of covering the rear greatly lengthened the battle line. As a result, after Qin Shi repelled Xuanzhen with his sword, Dragon Head Peak appeared not far in front of them. At this moment, Qin Shi didn't need to think with his but to know. They were going to activate the Great Sun Moonstar Formation. Since this formation was the final killing move that the Grand Pure Divine Ancestor had left behind for Tian Capital, it must have its unique features. Qin Shi didn't think that he was a match for the Grand Pure Divine Ancestor, so he deliberately lured everyone to the periphery of the floating islands. His goal was to make the 10 Heavenly Venerables stay away from the Imperial Polarity Hall and prevent them from activating the formation at any time. Qin Shi had achieved his goal. However, he still didn't expect. The 10 Heavenly Venerables, who held high positions, would have the courage to burn their blood essence and sacrifice themselves at the same time. Xuanzhen fell. Yinghua stepped forward again. The Heavenly Venerables, who used to be high and mighty, fell one after another, but the remaining few stood up resolutely and continued to cover the rear for their companions. Although they couldn't block one or two moves from Qin Shi, they could create some obstacles for Qin Shi and buy some time for everyone to escape. When only 3 Heavenly Venerables were left beside Yu Huan, the group of 4 finally flew to Dragon Head Peak. For Tian Capital, for the Divine Ancestor's reputation. Go Yu Huan. We'll do our best to buy time for you. A fierce look flashed across the Taihua Heavenly Venerable's face. Then he and the other 2 Heavenly Venerables turned to face Qin Shi, who was chasing after them with a sword. Seeing this, Qin Shi couldn't help but yell fiercely, "Get lost!" The battle was coming to an end. As long as the 3 people in front of him were defeated, Tian Capital would have no chance of counterattacking. Therefore, Qin Shi no longer held back and decisively used his killing move. The saber was formless, the sword was formless, and the vast expanse could shatter the universe. The sound came with the sword, its momentum unparalleled. The 3 Heavenly Venerables with the lowest cultivation didn't even have time to scream before they were completely pulverized by the billions of saber lights and sword shadows. However, it was also because they risked their lives to stop Yuhuan Tianzuan successfully flew to the front of the Imperial Polarity Hall. As soon as he landed, Yuhuan Tianzuan suddenly let out a long howl and slammed his palm into the center of the square. In an instant, the entire floating island trembled violently. Feeling the tremors from Dragon Head Peak, Yuhuan Tianzuan couldn't help but tremble with excitement. After tens of thousands of years of silence, the array pattern that the Divine Ancestor personally engraved on the square finally showed its brilliance to the world. Divine Ancestor above. The Emperor's majestic North Tower, the Divine Ancestor's vast kindness shakes the southern sky. Fortunately, we did not disappoint you. Chapter 441. I wish everyone a happy new year. I'm sure you'll be rich this year. It's New Year's Day, so all my relatives and friends will come over to play. I'm busy cooking at home, so I really can't write. I hope everyone can bear with me in the new year. I'll remember to update it. I'll update it at night and in the morning. I'm so moral. Happy New Year. Returning from cultivation to become a stay-at-home dad. Please wait a moment. After the content is updated, please refresh the page to get the latest update. Chapter 442. As Yuhuan Tianzuan slammed his palm down, the formation runes engraved on the plaza began to glow. Just as Qin Shi had expected, this formation was indeed the final killing move left behind by the Pure Sky Saint Ancestor for Tiandu. Ever since the Pure Sky Saint Ancestor led the ancient cultivators to build Tiandu, this formation had been engraved on Dragon Head Peak. But what was strange was that the ancient books left behind by the Pure Sky Saint Ancestor did not record any description of this formation, so no one knew what this formation was used for. Perhaps it was an illusion formation, perhaps it was a killing formation. In short, it should not be activated unless it was absolutely necessary. Speaking of which, it was important to mention something important. It was not that Qin Shi did not want to stop the formation from activating, but that he could not stop it at all. Unless he could kill the 10 Celestial Venerables in one move, the 10 Celestial Venerables would activate the formation at the most dangerous moment. This was a paradox in itself. After all, the formation carried Tiandu's last hope and was also the foundation of Tiandu's standing in the great world. Just like playing cards, when Yuhuan Tianzuan lost everything, he would naturally place his hopes on this trump card. And now, it was time to reveal this trump card. It had to be said that this trump card was indeed somewhat extraordinary. As the formation runes on the plaza appeared one after another, the Great Sun Moonstar formation above the floating islands suddenly dimmed a lot, and the entire great world fell into darkness. Seeing this, She could not help but be on guard and carefully analyze the changes in order to find the location of the formation's life gate as soon as possible. Whether it was an illusion formation or a killing formation, there would usually be two life and death gates when setting it up. On one hand, it was to prevent the formation from covering their allies, and on the other hand, it was convenient for the person setting up the formation to enter and exit the formation. But what made Shi feel a little strange was, the formation in front of him did not seem to have two life and death gates. As soon as the formation was activated, one after another, flickering lines of law slowly appeared in the void. Even if Yuhuan Tianzuan had not grasped the true meaning of the word void, he could still see these lines of law with his naked eye. Of course, in Yuhuan Tianzuan's eyes, these lines of law were just waves of vital essence. The lines of law crisscrossed in the void. From afar, it looked like a large net covering the entire great world. Then, these lines of law tightened, and the 120,000 floating islands became fish and shrimps in the net. At the same time, the soul mirror stored in the Imperial Hall suddenly released a dazzling golden light, and flew to the center of the plaza with a whoosh. The formation runes in the center was a circular shape, with a circular hole in the middle. After the soul mirror flew, it directly landed on the circular hole. Heavenly Venerable Yu Huan stared blankly at everything before him. Although the formation to Tianzuan was it to the sky to it to was. However, just as he was absent-minded, the soul mirror actually automatically combined with the formation patterns. Immediately after, an extremely intense true essence fluctuation erupted, and actually blasted Heavenly Venerable Yu Huan flying far away all of a sudden. Something unexpected happened. The great world. The 120,000 floating islands began to shake violently under the influence of an unknown force. The spirit energy on the floating islands originated from the dragon veins on the various islands, but now these dragon veins were like a volcanic eruption, gushing out and gathering at the peak of Dragon Head Peak. The spirit energy surged crazily in one place, and for a moment, it caused an unprecedented spirit energy tide in the great world. Seeing this, Shi no longer cared about snatching the soul mirror, and turned to leave the center of the storm that had yet to form. But what he didn't expect was, even though he had already stepped into the insightful emptiness realm, he was still like a 3-year-old child in front of the Grand Pure One's laws. He couldn't use brute force to tear open this gradually tightening net. The inescapable net formed by the lines of law tightened, and the 120,000 floating islands gathered in one place. The floating islands in the center were still fine, as there was still some space between them, so no collisions occurred. But the floating islands at the edge were in trouble. Many of the floating islands were pushed by the net, and they collided with the nearest floating islands. The scene was so tragic that it was like a serial car accident on the highway. In an instant, mountains collapsed, the earth cracked, and rocks flew. The residents on the islands were howling in grief. This? After seeing the tragic situation at the periphery of the floating islands, Yuhuan Tianzuan felt a chill run down his back, and his heart was filled with inexplicable fear. He would never have thought. The formation left behind by the Grand Pure One was not to defend against enemies, but to destroy Heaven Capital's foundation. Grand Pure One, could this be the last hope you left for Heaven Capital? Hope. Ha ha! Seeing the floating islands in the distance continuously colliding and sinking, Yuhuan Tianzuan was filled with despair. He wanted to use this opportunity to turn the tables, but who would have thought the result would be like this? After receiving such a blow, Yuhuan Tianzuan suddenly seemed to have gone crazy, and he couldn't help but sit at the edge of the square and laugh wildly. Unlike Yuhuan Tianzuan's despair, Shi seemed to have realized the crux of the matter. Thus, he immediately turned and rushed toward the soul mirror in the center of the square, and at the same time, he slashed out with his sword in an attempt to destroy it. Shi had used 10% of his strength in this attack. But after he slashed out, the soul mirror embedded in the center of the square was like a black hole, and it almost instantly swallowed up the sword light. Even a stone thrown into the water would cause a splash, but Shi's sword light did not even cause a ripple. Seeing this, Shi did not panic. Instead, he continued to slash at the soul mirror, trying to forcibly stop the formation's operation. But no matter how many times he slashed, the result was the same. As soon as the sword light approached the soul mirror, it seemed to be affected by something and was directly swallowed up by the soul mirror. It did not even cause the slightest movement, and it disappeared without a trace. And just as Shi was thinking about how to destroy the formation, The formation patterns in the square suddenly emitted a faint energy fluctuation like an energy cannon that had been fully charged. Qin sensed that something was wrong. Just as he was about to take a closer look, the soul mirror in the center of the square suddenly emitted a blinding light. The light was so strong that it was not inferior to the sun. Qin subconsciously blinked. But at this moment, an extremely strong gravitational force suddenly came from where the soul mirror was. Qin was caught off guard and was directly pulled to the ground by this gravitational force. At the same time, all the floating islands that were enveloped by the light were like space stations that had lost control and were rapidly flying toward the center of the light. Chapter 443. A beam of light suddenly shot out from Dragon Head Peak, followed by an extremely powerful gravitational force. This gravitational force was so strong that it could even drag Qin down from the sky, let alone other objects in the great world. No one or object could resist this powerful gravitational force. It seemed to have combined all the spiritual energy in the great world. The moment the light appeared, it pulled all 120,000 floating islands to the vicinity of Dragon Head Peak. The scene was so spectacular that it could be described as hundreds of barges and thousands of sails competing. One after another, the floating islands collided in the void. Each collision would set off an earth-shattering boom, accompanied by the cries and wails of countless living beings. Many of the weaker cultivators were turned into dust on the spot in the collision. Even those with higher cultivation, such as the 5 divine generals, could not escape the pull of the strong light even though they could successfully avoid the collision of the peaks. This scene was very similar to a flush toilet. One only needed to gently press the switch, and all the filth and turbidity in the world would rush into the sewer along with the rapid flow of water. Yuan Qinzuan, who was closest to the strong light, was the first to disappear. He did not even have the time to scream before he was sucked away by the strong light in the blink of an eye. Immediately after, the Imperial Extreme Hall also turned into thousands of dust and debris and disappeared into the strong light. Then, the flowers, trees, sand and stones on Dragon Head Peak, whether it was birds, beasts, divine generals or star lords, as long as they were enveloped by the strong light, they would be instantly sucked in and completely disappear. This strong light was like a white hole, crazily devouring everything in the great world. After swallowing Dragon Head Peak, it began to devour the surrounding floating islands as if it would never be full. Qin bitterly resisted the strong gravitational force brought about by the strong light. He looked back at the square and found that it had completely turned into a white sphere of light. The strong light came from the central region of this sphere of light, and there was a strange black region at the edge of the sphere that looked like a ribbon in the void. In any case, Qin was someone who had seen big scenes. Therefore, after seeing such a scene, a term immediately popped up in his mind: a white hole. One must know that in the vast universe, in addition to the black hole that could even swallow light, there was also an existence with a completely opposite nature. This was the white hole. To put it simply, if the black hole was the entrance to a certain space, then the white hole would be the exit of this space. The black hole was responsible for swallowing, while the white hole was responsible for spitting. Once the Grand Pure Saint Ancestor's Sun-Moon-Star formation was activated, all the objects in the large world would be gradually wrapped up in an inescapable net and stuffed into a white hole. Then, through the white hole, these objects would be sent to another unknown world. Qin didn't want to be sent to some strange place again. Therefore, when he realized the true function of the formation, he used all his strength and began to struggle madly. In any case, he was at the Dongshu stage. Thus, his efforts played a certain role in the end. As a result, he was able to successfully go against the current and arrive at the border of the Heavenly Network. The Heavenly Network was formed by the threads of law. Qin tried to touch it, but realized that these laws weren't something he could control at his current stage. Therefore, he immediately took out the sword in his hand and tried to tear this large net apart with brute force. However, no matter how hard he tried, the large net didn't budge. And as the inescapable net tightened, by the time most of the 120,000 floating islands had been swallowed up, Qin was like a fish in a net. She could only watch in despair as she was continuously dragged towards the white hole by the large net. F***ck. After some time, when Qin regained consciousness, he realized that he was in an unfamiliar vacuum environment. This vacuum environment was different from the dark space Qin had been in before. There were radiation, magnetic fields, rays and various dust impurities that Qin was familiar with here. He calmed himself down and looked up. To his surprise, there was a gigantic planet beside him. Qin was shocked. He immediately flew out of the rubble and came to the star belt of this planet. Earthlings grew up looking at pictures of the 8 major planets in the solar system. Thus, Qin recognized it at a glance. This gigantic planet with a ring around it was none other than Saturn. Had he returned to the solar system? Thinking of this, Qin was suddenly excited. He quickly flew out of the star belt and went straight to the periphery of Saturn. A bright red star entered Qin's eyes, the sun. It really was the sun. The final trump card that the Taiching ancestor left for Heaven Capital was actually a teleportation array that led directly to the solar system. Qin looked back and saw that the 120,000 floating islands had all turned into ruins and were completely merged into Saturn's star belt. Yuhuan Qinzuan's aura was still there. Except for Taihua and the other 2 who were killed by Qin, the auras of the remaining 7 heavenly venerables were still there. They did not die because of the activation of the array. However, while the 10 heavenly venerables were fine, the residents of the great world were in trouble. Only those whose cultivation had reached the golden core stage and above could maintain their vitality in the universe and luckily escape this disaster. However, even in Heaven Capital, there were only a few people whose cultivation had reached the golden core stage and above. As for those unlucky people whose cultivation had not reached the golden core stage, right now, they had already turned into ice-cold corpses one after another. There was no pain or wailing. Just like that, they died peacefully the moment the array was activated. There were at least tens of millions of them. Seeing this, even Qin, who had long been accustomed to death, could not help but feel sad at this moment. After this battle, the vitality of the ancient cultivators was greatly damaged. It also almost shook the foundation of Heaven Capital that had been passed down for tens of thousands of years. Qin originally only wanted to go to the Great World to find the Soul Mirror and use it to get Ying back. Who would have thought that this trip would be so complicated? Perhaps. The Taiching ancestor had considered the instability of the Great World from the beginning, so he deliberately left behind such an arrangement of cutting off the tail to survive and abandoning the rook to save the king. After all, Earth was their home and where their roots lay. Qin's cultivation was the highest, so he woke up the fastest. Thus, he quietly floated in the void and began to seriously consider the next problem of how to deal with the aftermath. Right now, the core strength of Heaven Capital was gathered in the solar system. If he left it alone, even without the 10 heavenly venerables, the 5 divine generals would be enough to flatten the solar system. But if he wanted to eliminate them all in one fell swoop, wouldn't it be too cruel? How should he deal with it? This was really a complicated problem. Chapter 444. Qin hadn't considered the issue of Tiandu's aftermath for too long. After all, he hadn't even settled his own family's affairs, so where would he find the time to care about other people's affairs? He had to find a way to retrieve Ying's soul. That was what Qin needed to do right now. Thus, Qin began a careful search of the ruins of Saturn's ring. Saturn's volume was 830 times that of Earth, and its rings were formed after comets and asteroids collided. Its width alone was 25 times that of Earth's diameter. Thus, when the 120,000 floating islands were thrown into Saturn's rings, it was like sand falling into the sea, not causing any waves at all. Perhaps because the formation had just been activated, the strange energy fluctuations on the soul mirror had completely disappeared. Qin searched the floating island ruins for a long time, almost inch by inch before finally finding that damnable mirror in one of the meteorite ruins. The sky-bearing mirror of floating dawn. The soul mirror was buried deep in the soil, so it was inevitable that it was stained with some dust and dirt. Qin summoned it back with his inner energy, and a bone-chilling sensation came as soon as he touched it. In all honesty, the soul mirror really did appear to be a little mundane now that it had lost that unknown energy fluctuation. A dull mirror with a dark yellow frame. If it weren't for the exquisite patterns on the frame, and the mysterious power of the law faintly contained within, Qin wouldn't have believed that this mirror was actually a legendary artifact. Kane peerless treasure. Perhaps this was what they meant by returning to one's natural state. The soul mirror wasn't an offensive treasure, so for Qindu, its symbolic significance was far greater than its actual significance. When the Sun-Moon-Star formation was activated, Qin didn't sense any spiritual fluctuations, so he deduced that the formation had nothing to do with the soul bridge. Whether it was the formation or the soul bridge. Both were meant to travel to Earth, but the methods used were completely different. The Sun-Moon-Star formation was too barbaric and crude, and Qiandu's soul wasn't enough to activate it. Its true source of power was actually all the dragon veins in the great world. That was why when it was activated, it would set off a tidal wave of spiritual qi that was close to landslides and tsunamis. Qin tried to infuse his true essence into the soul mirror, but there was no reaction. Thus, after a moment of hesitation, he separated a strand of his spirit from his heart aperture and carefully poured it into the soul mirror. Qin was already cautious enough. After all, this was a Khanate cardinal treasure that he had never come into contact with before. But he didn't expect that the moment his spirit entered the mirror, it was as if Qin's soul had been sucked away by the soul mirror, causing him to lose all sense of the outside world. His divine sense entered the soul mirror. It was only then that this Khanate supreme treasure truly displayed its uniqueness. There was a strange consciousness space within the soul mirror, which was also the place where Xiannu's soul was stored. As soon as Qin's consciousness entered the soul mirror, he felt as if he'd fallen into the yellow springs or the river Styx. He was surrounded by dense resentment that refused to dissipate. Perhaps his arrival had disturbed the Yin souls that had been imprisoned here for many years, so much so that the resentment of these Yin souls was like bats in a bat cave, and they actually rushed towards him in groups. Qin couldn't help but snort angrily when he saw this. The spiritual pressure of a Dongshu cultivator immediately spread out. Arbiter Xiannu's cultivation wasn't high to begin with. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she was an ordinary person, so how strong could her soul be? Yin souls didn't have consciousness, but they still retained their instincts to seek good fortune and avoid calamity. Thus, when Qin released his aura, the Yin souls scattered like frightened birds and beasts, not daring to approach him at all. One had to know that the soul mirror and the real world were two completely different concepts. The soul mirror was somewhat similar to a cultivator's sea of consciousness. In this space the five senses were useless. They could only sense each other through their souls. And in Qin's perception, in this mysterious and strange soul mirror, there was a faint fluctuation of a soul that he was extremely familiar with. Although it was very weak, like a grain of gold in a vast sea of sand, Qin was still able to sense its existence immediately. This was the throbbing of the soul. It was also the bond between two people who truly loved each other. One look and they could see each other. One step was like a heavy city. Love was separated by mountains and seas. The mountains and seas couldn't be leveled. There were boats to cross the seas. There were roads to cross the mountains. This love overturned the mountains and seas. The mountains and seas could be leveled. Qin suddenly looked over. He felt as if there was someone waiting for him in the depths of his sea of consciousness. Thus, he rushed forward without hesitation. Along the way all the Yin souls avoided him. Only the fluorescent light still floated silently in the same place. In the blink of an eye, Qin arrived at the position of the fluorescent light. Ying, is it you? I'm here to pick you up. As he spoke, he tried to reach out to the fluorescent light. However, he completely forgot that he was in a space similar to the heart aperture. There was no way he could directly touch the other party. Chapter 445. The so-called revolution was the circular movement of the 8 planets around the Sun. Every time the Earth revolved around the Sun, it meant that another year had passed. The 8 planets of the solar system were born from the accretion disk of the same star, so they all revolved in the same direction, from west to east around the Sun. The length of each planet's orbit was different, so it naturally took them different amounts of time to complete one revolution. Using Earth's time as an example, Mercury took 68 days to complete one revolution, Saturn took 29 years to complete one revolution, and Pluto, which was the furthest from the Sun, took as long as 248 years to complete one revolution. It was precisely because of this that it was very difficult for the 8 planets to appear in the same straight line at the same time. Once it did, it would become a legendary phenomenon: 9 stars aligned. Ever since the birth of human civilization, there had never been a true 9 stars aligned. Although there was a 7 stars aligned on May 20, 2000, it was only a convergence of 7 stars. The more planets there were, the more difficult it was for them to converge in a straight line at the same time. This was a geometrical problem. Compared to the age of the planets, human civilization was still far too short. With a mere 6,000 years of civilization, humans hadn't even fully explored the solar system. So how could they dare to dream of exploring the vast universe? On this day, October 21st, it was supposed to be an ordinary day. However, under the influence of the soul mirror, Tiandu unexpectedly descended into the solar system. Of course, this wasn't important. What was important was, after going through untold hardships, Qin finally obtained the soul mirror he yearned for day and night. Because of this, he also found Ying Ying's long-lost soul. However, what he didn't expect was, in the instant that he activated the soul mirror and attempted to release the Yin spirits within, the soul mirror didn't activate as he had imagined. Instead, it suddenly erupted with an extremely powerful and unknown force. This force was so strong that it even pushed Saturn, which was revolving in its orbit, to rotate in the opposite direction. Qin sensed that something was amiss in the outside world. Just as he was feeling a little puzzled, an extremely powerful tremor also appeared within the soul mirror. It was like a bottle of water being violently shaken in someone's hand, and the thousands of yin spirits within the bottle were instantly sent flying in all directions. Qin hastily protected Qin Ruoying's divine soul. However, immediately thereafter, his soul was instantly dragged out of the soul mirror by a burst of invisible power, as if it were a small boat caught in a whirlpool. After his soul returned to his body, Qin suddenly opened his eyes. He lowered his head and saw that the soul mirror was still in his hands. However, the previously dull surface of the mirror now faintly rippled with circles of ripples. Seeing this, Qin was shocked and quickly withdrew his true essence. He withdrew his true essence. But unfortunately, however, the soul mirror continued to operate. At this moment, Qin suddenly realized, in addition to Saturn, even Jupiter, Mars, Neptune, and Uranus began to rotate in the opposite direction under the influence of this unknown force. Among them, Venus and Mercury, which were closer to the Sun, suddenly accelerated their revolutions and converged with the Earth in a straight line. With the exception of Earth, the 8 planets all changed their respective orbital speeds and directions, converging into a straight line at a speed visible to the naked eye. In an instant, the alignment of 9 stars, a sudden phenomenon. After 10,000 years, this peerless formation set up by the Taiching divine ancestor was finally revealed to the world in its entirety. Even the great formation of sun, moon, and stars in the great world was actually only one of its subformations. The moment the alignment of 9 stars occurred, a large nomological net formed by the laws of heaven and earth vaguely appeared at the boundary of the solar system. This was something that had to be mentioned. The boundary of the solar system, which was the place where the sun's gravity could cover. There were as many as 100 billion comets there. These comets were gathered together by the sun's gravity, thus forming a spherical cloud, which was also known as the Oort cloud by scientists. If one were to look at it in another way, the Oort cloud could be seen as the atmosphere, and the comets within it could be seen as droplets of water vapor in the atmosphere. The moment the nomological net appeared, Qin was completely stunned. This large net was somewhat similar to the inescapable net in the great world, but it contained nomological attributes that Qin could not understand at all. One had to know that Qin had already stepped into the insightful void realm. However, when he saw this scene, he still felt a sense of loss and helplessness in his heart. It was like a primary school student trying to solve a calculus problem in university mathematics. The moment he saw those densely packed numbers and symbols, Qin was completely stunned. These were all left behind by the Taiching divine ancestor. The solar system was not like the great world. The area of 120,000 floating islands added together was at most equivalent to the area of Asia. But what about the solar system? Even if one flew at the speed of light, it would take an entire year to fly to the boundary of the solar system. And this was only the radius of the solar system. The more you know, the more you can recognize your own insignificance. To the current Qin, this sentence had become the supreme truth. At that moment, Qin even began to suspect, had he returned to Earth from heavenly spiral? Before he had reached the insightful void realm, he naturally could not see the nomological imprints at the boundary of the solar system. And it was precisely because he could not see these nomological imprints that he, who was only at the soul formation stage, could fly into the solar system without any hindrance and then return to Earth without any hindrance. Now that he thought about it, Qin's heart was suddenly filled with a creepy feeling. It was too terrifying. He did not even know how he came back. He had originally thought that he would be able to roam the universe freely after reaching the soul formation stage. Who would have thought, even in the periphery of a mere solar system, there was such a shocking net of laws? If it were not for someone secretly opening the way for him, how could he, who was only at the soul formation stage, so easily pass through this net of nomological laws? Everyone would more or less suffer from paranoia, and Qin was no exception. So, he was afraid. Although he did not know the true use of this net of nomological laws, Qin could still sense the supreme power contained in it as long as he used his heart to feel it. This was an absolute power that was above the insightful void stage and even the Tao integration stage. Perhaps only true immortals who had experienced the great tribulation of heaven and earth could control it. With this in mind, Qin felt as if the soul mirror in his hand was a hot potato that he could not throw away even if he wanted to, and it was very hot in his hand, But if he continued to use the soul mirror, Qin would not dare to do so even if he had 100 guts. After all, Yingying's soul was still inside. Who knew how many secrets were hidden in this broken mirror? What if he caused some kind of trouble? What should he do then? Qin was stunned as he looked at the spectacular 9-star alignment in front of him. Chapter 446. With scruples in their hearts, they were no longer fearless. Most young people looked down on those mediocre middle-aged people. Little did they know that these middle-aged people were just like them back then, fearless in life and fearless in death. Qin's fear did not originate from his heart, but from the outside world. This was because he had already become a middle-aged man from a young age. He had a lover, a child, and a family of his own. He was the sky of this family, the umbrella of this family, and the pillar of this family. So, shouldn't he be afraid? If it was in the past, Qin would definitely continue to study the soul mirror. He would even try to erase the mark left behind by the grand pure divine ancestor and turn it into his natal magic treasure. But now, such thoughts did not appear in his mind at all. After all, Qin was already old. Back to the spectacular 9-star alignment, which could be called a space wonder. Under the push of the soul mirror, the 9 planets quickly converged into a straight line. From afar, it looked like a cannon was in place and ready to fire at any time. The 9-star alignment lasted for about 2 minutes. During these 2 minutes, Qin's mood was as tense as a string. He was afraid that the 9-star alignment would affect Earth, so he raised his essence, energy, and spirit to the highest point early on. If anything strange happened next, Qin would rush back to Earth immediately and take away Yinyin, Yingying, and everyone else he cared about. He might not be able to stop the 9-star alignment, but it would not be easy to hurt his family in front of him. Qin had already prepared for the worst, but he did not expect. What happened next was completely different from what he had imagined. The 9-star alignment did not have any destructive impact on the solar system. The only thing that was affected was the large net of laws entrenched in the periphery of the solar system. He saw, the moment the 9 stars gathered, the large net that contained the unknown power of laws began to flicker faintly. If the 9-star alignment was a key, then the large net of laws was a door. All he needed to do was insert the key into the keyhole and twist it gently. This huge net of laws that had shrouded the solar system for over 10,000 years slowly loosened. The stars moved and all living things were in the universe. The 9 stars returned to their positions and the laws disappeared. After the invisible power from the soul mirror disappeared, the 8 planets and the degraded Pluto began to revolve in their original orbits. This rare spectacle of the 9 stars alignment was like an unreachable mirage. Apart from making Qin worry for a while, it didn't leave anything else behind. After a flash of white light, the soul mirror reverted back to its previous dull and lifeless state. At this moment, the large net of laws that made even Qin's heart palpitate completely vanished. Qin frowned as he looked at the distant Oat Nebula. That was the boundary of the solar system, and also the boundary between the solar system and the universe. He vaguely felt that he had accidentally triggered some sort of mechanism, so he could not help but want to go to the Oat Nebula to check it out. But after thinking about it, in the end, Qin suppressed the throbbing in his heart and flew towards Saturn's ring with the soul mirror in hand. The people from Celestial Capital were still unconscious. Once they woke up, these people would inevitably yearn for their former home, which would bring a huge impact to Earth. Qin did not want any external forces to interfere with the self-development of Earth's civilization, so he set up a large formation on Saturn's ring and imprisoned all the refugees from Celestial Capital in the formation. This was only a temporary measure. Yingying had not woken up yet, and Yinyin was still waiting for him at home, so why would Qin waste too much time dealing with the refugees from Celestial Capital? It would not be too late to come back and clean up the mess in Celestial Capital after he dealt with the problems at home. Therefore, after hurriedly setting up the formation, Qin headed straight for Earth without looking back. Yinyin, I'm back. Qin did not know that at the same time he set off to return to Earth, outside the distant Oat Nebula. A wooden boat was rushing into the Oat Nebula at an extremely fast speed. The Oat Nebula was made up of trillions of comets. Compared to it, the small wooden boat suddenly looked extremely small, like a microorganism under a microscope. 2 teenagers of 15 or 16 years old sat on the boat. One of them sat at the bow, holding a magic weapon that looked like an oar in his hand. Every time the teenager waved the oar, the wooden boat would suddenly rush forward tens of thousands of miles in an extremely strange way. Changhua, what are you doing? The teenager sitting at the stern was busy cultivating, so he did not pay attention to the direction the wooden boat was heading. At this moment, he looked up and found that the surroundings were full of comets of different sizes. He was so scared that his face turned pale. He quickly grabbed the corner of the teenager's clothes and shouted, "This is the Tianshu ruins. Do you want to die? Turn around. Turn around. I don't want to die here with you." Hearing this, the teenager called Chung Hua seemed to have gone crazy. He did not care about his companion's dissuasion. Instead, he waved the oar in his hand wildly, so that the speed of the wooden boat instantly increased by 30%. Seeing this, the teenager sitting at the stern was not willing to wait for death. He immediately raised his hands and directly launched an attack at the teenager who was driving the boat. The boat of friendship really capsized so easily. Chung Hua seemed to have expected this. Seeing that his companion was attacking him, he did not panic at all. He directly used the oar as a weapon and fought back. The two of them were about the same age, so their cultivation was naturally similar. Therefore, while Chung Hua was dealing with his companion's attack, he still had time to laugh and said, "Fei, didn't you always say that the universe is so big that although you can't see it all in your life, you have to set foot in 2 or 3 places? The Tianshu ruins are right in front of you. Don't you want to go in and have a look?" Hearing this, the teenager called Fei's face turned cold. He said hatefully, "The Tianshu ruins is known as an ancient forbidden area. Anyone who trespasses will die. Do you really think that these legends are only used to fool 3-year-old children? Ah, are you afraid? Of course I'm not afraid of you." The teenager was arrogant to begin with. How could he endure such ridicule from his companion? Therefore Fei no longer showed mercy. He directly drew his long sword and fought with Chung Hua. The two of them fought back and forth, but they did not notice at all. The wooden boat had already gone deep into the Haute Nebula. When the wooden boat rushed out of the Haute Nebula, the two of them suddenly felt that their eyes were wide open, so they could not help but stop what they were doing. "This is the Tianshu ruins? We're actually here?" The two teenagers stared blankly at the solar system in front of them. Even the daring Chung Hua was shocked at this moment. The reason why Chung Hua dared to drive the wooden boat close to the Haute Nebula was because he knew the power of this cloud-piercing shuttle. One had to know that this cloud-piercing shuttle was his father's most important treasure. It was personally made by a supreme being, and its speed was extremely fast. When the host was in danger, the cloud-piercing shuttle could even instantly turn into a defensive treasure to protect the host. This was also the reason why Chung Hua dared to go close to the Haute Nebula. He just wanted to scare Fei. Who would have thought that the two of them would actually break into the legendary forbidden area without any hindrance? The Tianshu ruins? Chapter 447. Generosity should be rewarded, and arrogance should stop the youthful heart. According to Earth's standards, Chung Hua and Fei were still underage. However, relying on their extraordinary cultivation base, these two brats, who were still wet behind the ears, were actually more courageous than most people. They didn't understand how they could enter the Tianshu ruins so easily. However, after confirming that it really happened, even the cautious Fei didn't complain about going back. Instead, he became excited. The boat of friendship started moving again. The two youths squeezed at the front of the boat and watched the cloud-piercing shuttle enter the solar system at an extremely fast speed. There was no fear of the unknown in their eyes, only a strong yearning for the ancient legends. "Chung Hua, it's better to be careful. Rumor has it that the Tianshu ruins are the cultivation grounds of the ancient Almighty. Although there may be great opportunities hidden inside, there are also hidden dangers. Our cultivation levels are still low. Without this cloud-piercing shuttle, we wouldn't even be able to roam the stars freely. If there's some kind of formation on this planet, we'll probably die here today." As he spoke, Fei pointed at Pluto, which was not far away. Pluto was only 1/3 the size of the moon. From afar, it didn't give off any sense of visual oppression. Dwarf planets like Pluto were extremely common in the universe. However, Pluto was inside the Tianshu ruins. Therefore, even though the two of them had roamed the stars since they were young and were used to all kinds of dangers in the universe, they didn't dare to approach it at all. Therefore, the two of them drove the wooden boat around Pluto, and after making sure that there was nothing worth exploring, they quickly sailed to the next planet. In reality, the solar system was like an egg. The sun was the yolk, the space where the 8 planets were was the egg white, and the outermost Haute Nebula, which was covered with trillions of comets, was the eggshell. The dense comets floated around the solar system, so the situation inside the solar system couldn't be seen from the outside. And this was in the eyes of outsiders, Tianshu ruins. For the immortal cultivators in the outside world, the Tianshu ruins were like a dried-up treasure trove. According to ancient records, before the Tianshu ruins were sealed, it was once a holy land for cultivation. Even the glorious jade-clear grotto heaven was once only one of the inheritances in the Tianshu ruins. Of course, the Tianshu ruins back then was not called the Tianshu ruins. Instead, it was called Tianshu realm. Later, for some reason, the Tianshu realm, which was at its peak, suddenly declined. Then, an ancient almighty set up a heaven and earth formation, completely isolating this galaxy from the outside world. Under the protection of the formation, no one could approach the Oat Nebula. In the blink of an eye, tens of thousands of years had passed. Everything about the Tianshu ruins gradually faded from people's minds as time passed. It wasn't until a few years ago that a brilliant genius appeared in the jade-clear grotto heaven that the Tianshu ruins returned to the public sight. This genius had cultivated for less than 1,000 years, but his cultivation had already stepped into the ranks of Empyrean. Because of this, he was known as the #1 cultivator below the supreme realm. He even had hopes of becoming the next supreme headmaster of the jade-clear grotto. But it was a pity, however, this young, celestial lord was crazy for some unknown reason. He actually wanted to use the method of exploring the Tianshu ruins to make his name resound throughout the supreme palace enclosure. Yuan, read Yuan as in broken and ruined walls. Luoyang was known as the ancient capital of 13 dynasties, but after 2,000 years, it had become a third-tier city. The Tianshu ruins had been quiet for more than 2,000 years. Tens of thousands of years had passed. The immortal cultivators in the supreme palace enclosure had long forgotten its former glory. This Tianshu realm master wanted to use the Tianshu ruins as a stepping stone, but he never expected, in front of the sun, moon and stars formation, he was like a moth to a flame. He did not even cause a spark before he turned into a wisp of smoke and disappeared from the world. This was also the reason why no one dared to approach the Oat Nebula. The young man did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. He was not afraid of the slightest thing. Thus, the two daring brats piloted the cloud-piercing shuttle and hurried in the direction of Earth. Back to Qinshi. After imprisoning the people of Tiandu in Saturn's ring, he rushed back to Earth. Shangjing City, which he had not seen in a long time. The courtyard, which he had not seen in a long time. It was late autumn. The old locust tree in the courtyard had already shed its leaves. The withered leaves were piled up on the bluestone floor. When the autumn wind blew, a few leaves drifted out of the courtyard. It was not the courtyard that was deserted, but the people's hearts. Qinshi did not like this feeling. Thus, he frowned and looked around the courtyard. After confirming that his restrictions were not damaged, he immediately waved his hand and used his supreme cultivation to forcefully reverse the flowering of the plants in the courtyard. In an instant, it was as if spring had returned to the earth. Hundreds of flowers bloomed. Even the old locust tree in the courtyard suddenly grew lush green leaves. Accompanied by the overflowing fragrance of the flowers, Qinshi strode toward the west wing. It was now 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Shangjing. Nianyan was not at home. Qin Yongyan and the big cat should be waiting for her at the school gate. Thus, in the huge courtyard, there was only a fish that could only roll its eyes all day long. Qinshi pushed open the door. Qin Ruoying's figure came into view. A year was enough time for the brand new quilt to be dyed a little dark yellow. However, it did not leave any trace on Qin Ruoying's face. She lay quietly on the bed as if she was asleep. Qinshi came to the bedside. After smoothing out her hair that was messed up by Nianyan, he gently held his lover's hand. "Ying, I'm back. I'm sorry, I've kept you waiting." As she spoke, Qinshi took out that damned broken mirror from her bosom. This was the first time he looked at a magic treasure so carefully. It was as if he was not looking at himself in the mirror but Qin Ruoying in the mirror. This was a Khanate treasure. Not only did it involve the soul of Shen, but it also involved the great formation of sun and moon and stars. Thus, Qinshi did not dare to activate it lightly. He had found the soul mirror. Ying had not woken up yet. So what was he waiting for? Qinshi hesitated for a long time. Then, as if he had finally come to a decision, he gently kissed his lover's forehead. Then he silently sat cross-legged next to Qin Ruoying. He prepared to let his soul enter the soul mirror again. Then, like last time, he would imbue the soul mirror with vital essence in order to activate it. This time, whether it was the explosion of the sky or the 9-star alignment, he must bring Ying's soul out. Please remember the domain name of this book. 9 Heavens Divine Emperor Mobile Version website. Chapter 448. Qin Shi hesitated for a long time before he finally came to a decision. He planted a gentle kiss on his lover's forehead before he sat down next to Qin Ruoying with his legs crossed. He was prepared to let his soul enter the spirit mirror again and infuse his inner energy into it to activate it just like last time. This time, whether it was the explosion of the heavenly capital or the 9-star alignment, he had to bring Yingying's soul out. It was fine when she didn't go home, but when she got home and saw that her lover was still lying quietly in bed, Qin Shi's heart suddenly felt very uncomfortable. He was very upset because he had failed to protect Qin Ruoying. After all, for a cultivator who had reached the Dongshu stage, what was the point of cultivating if he couldn't even protect the woman he loved? Even if I lived forever, I would be nothing more than a soulless zombie without you by my side. Therefore, Qin Shi was like a tortoise eating a scalpel this time. He was determined to rescue Qin Ruoying's soul. Even though he knew that activating the spirit mirror might lead to some unexpected things, he was not willing to wait any longer. He had waited for a long time. Yingying had also waited for a long time. He couldn't live without his lover, and Yin Yin couldn't live without her mother. This family couldn't live without a mistress. Therefore, after Qin Shi made his decision, he immediately infused his inner energy into the spirit mirror without hesitation. When he gave it his all, his inner energy was as vast and mighty as the Yangtze River, or as endless as the surging Yellow River. As the incomparably dense inner energy flowed into the spirit mirror, a strange white light suddenly lit up on the surface of the spirit mirror. Seeing this, Qin Shi immediately held his breath and entered the white light again using the method of astral projection. It was still the same strange space of consciousness. However, after Qin Shi entered, he suddenly realized that there were many subtle changes in this place. There were even some colors. One had to know that the space of consciousness was like a universe that had yet to be developed. Consciousness was an inexplicable and inexplicable thing. There was no concept of dimensions here, so the 5 senses were naturally useless. Everything could only be felt by the heart. As a result, everything he saw, heard, and even touched here. In fact, it was just a manifestation of one's inner consciousness. Therefore, theoretically speaking, there would not be any changes in the space of consciousness, because it did not have a proper form to begin with. But the strange thing was, this time, however, Qin Shi's feelings were completely different from last time. In his perception, this originally chaotic space of consciousness seemed to have been split open by Panga's giant axe at this moment. There was a sky here and suddenly there was a land. There was a dim yellow aurora in the sky and a dark green Styx river on the ground. Qin Shi was now standing in the middle of the river Styx. The river was not deep, barely reaching his knees. Qin Shi was a little surprised by the changes here. After carefully sensing for a while, he suddenly realized that the souls that had previously filled the entire space of consciousness had now all turned into fish in the river Styx, and were constantly rushing forward with the river Styx. Seeing this, Qin Shi could not help but frown as he walked forward along the river Styx. He did not know how long he had walked. Only then did he finally find that familiar fluctuation of divine soul again. It was still that weak fluorescent light. Yingying's soul was there. Qin Shi immediately ran toward the fluorescent light. However, as he got closer and closer to the fluorescent light, Qin Shi's mood became more and more serious. Because, he suddenly realized, the fluorescent light was at the end of the river Styx. Thousands of souls were following the river Styx and pouring into the fluorescent light. After realizing that something was wrong, Qin Shi's heart could not help but skip a beat. He thought that something had happened here. Therefore he did not even have time to think. He immediately used his soul to wrap around the fluorescent light and tried to bring it out of the soul mirror. However, the strange thing was, this fluorescent light seemed to have taken root in the space of consciousness. No matter how Qin Shi tried, the fluorescent light floated there quietly and did not move at all. After all, Qin Shi was now an immortal cultivator at the Dongshu stage. Even if he had left his physical body, his soul should still be extremely powerful. However, no matter how hard he tried, the fluorescent light did not move at all. After a few fruitless attempts, Qin Shi was instantly enraged. After hearing a wild roar, an extremely strong golden light suddenly erupted from his body. Then this golden light was like the sun rising from the east, instantly illuminating half of the space of consciousness and completely enveloping the fluorescent light. At the same time, Qin Shi's reckless behavior seemed to have affected the river Styx below. As a result, the river Styx suddenly dried up. Countless souls were like startled birds, instantly turning into soul bodies and flying out in all directions. The chaos had not even split, but it was already so severely injured. How powerful was Qin Shi's soul? What had entered the soul mirror before was only a wisp of it. But now, Qin wanted to completely separate his soul from his physical body and pour it all into the soul mirror. He wanted to use his soul to build a soul bridge that connected Qin Ruoying to the outside world and use it to forcibly bring her out of the soul mirror. Fortunately, the soul mirror was now an ownerless object. Chapter 449. Note: I made a mistake when I pasted the previous chapter. If you didn't see my note at the end of the chapter, then it's the wrong chapter. Sorry. The so-called husband and wife were actually, although they didn't have the colorful phoenix wings, their hearts were as one. Therefore, the moment Qin Ruoying opened her eyes, she suddenly realized that there might be a problem. As expected. After Qin Ruoying opened her eyes and saw him, she didn't get up and hug him immediately. Instead, she looked at him up and down with a strange and cold look. Seeing this, she couldn't help but frown slightly. At the same time, he stretched out his right hand to see her situation. But what she didn't expect was that, just as he reached out his hand, Qin Ruoying suddenly leaped up like a carp. Following that, she smoothly executed a set of wrist and arm lock martial arts. Looking at this posture, Ying seemed to want to take him down in one fell swoop. This set of self-defense kung fu was passed down in the Qin family. Although Qin Ruoying hadn't come into contact with kung fu before, she still stepped into the celestial being stage with the help of Qin Shi. It should be known that celestial beings were no longer in the ranks of ordinary people. It was just a few moves of wrist-locking kung fu. She only needed to take a look at it to master it. Qin Ruoying had always disliked fighting with people. If it wasn't for the fact that cultivation could increase her lifespan, and thus she could stay with Qin Shi forever, she was afraid that she wouldn't be willing to spend too much time on the road of cultivation. But now, Qin Ruoying, on the other hand, acted as if she had been possessed by Qin Wanqing. The moment she came up, she started fighting without a single word. Qin Shi was afraid of hurting her, so he immediately dispersed all the strength in his body. As a result, Qin Ruoying suddenly pressed him down on the bed by his arm. A dignified Dongshu stage cultivator was actually pressed down on the bed by a celestial being at this moment. If this matter were to spread, it would only shock people on the spot. Qin Shi didn't dare to move at all, but Qin Ruoying didn't show any mercy. After pressing Qin Shi down, Qin Ruoying turned over and mounted the horse directly on his back, and pressed him firmly on the bed. At this moment, Qin Ruoying seemed to not know Qin Shi at all. After pressing his neck from behind, she asked coldly, "Who are you?" Hearing this, Qin Shi could only tilt his head and ask in a muffled voice, "Ying, you don't even recognize me? I don't know you." After saying that, Qin Ruoying raised her head and looked around. The room was still the same room. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know she was, but she couldn't remember anything. She's she remember anything. Amnesia? Maybe. From the moment Qin Ruoying woke up to the moment she captured Qin Shi, the entire process seemed to have happened in the blink of an eye. At this moment, Qin Shi could roughly guess the reason. Normal people might think that this was amnesia. But in reality, this was a sign of a missing soul. It was probably because he forcibly took her soul out of the spirit mirror, so the soul he took out was incomplete, and Qin Ruoying lost her memories. After figuring out the crux of the matter, Qin Shi's originally tense mood immediately relaxed. It wasn't a big problem, it was just that her soul was missing. At worst, he could go to the spirit mirror later and the problem would be solved. However, Qin Ruoying's attitude towards him made Qin Shi, who was used to Ying's gentleness and consideration, suddenly feel like he was enjoying himself. In this world, other than Ying, which woman could ride on his back? Yin was still young, so she couldn't be considered a woman. Qin Ruoying rode on Qin Shi's back, and her two legs were straddling Qin Shi's waist. Therefore, the roots of her thighs were tightly pressed against Qin Shi's waist, and he was firmly sandwiched between them. Although she used a lot of strength, this strength was not even enough to tickle Qin Shi. Therefore, Qin Shi was not in a hurry to struggle. Instead, he lay on the bed and silently felt the softness coming from Ying's thighs. Tsk, this feeling, it was really bouncy, full, and alluring. He was used to eating a lady from a noble family who was as gentle as water. Suddenly, she was replaced with an ice beauty who was as cold as ice. The taste was simply wonderful. If Qin Ruoying knew what he was thinking, she would probably raise her hand and slap him across the face. Men are all pigs. Qin Shi was like a dead fish, lying on the bed and not moving at all. At this moment, Qin Ruoying seemed to have realized that her posture was a little indecent, so she immediately jumped up from his body and went straight to the door of the west wing. Chen Shi was busy savoring the feeling, and when Qin Ruoying left, it instantly made him feel a sense of emptiness, so he hurriedly got up and chased after her. Ying, don't run around, where are you going? Seeing that Chen Shi was chasing after her, Qin Ruoying turned her head and glared fiercely at him. Chen Shi had no choice but to hurriedly take a few steps back, and then put on an old face, indicating that he would not go near her. After that, Qin Ruoying then turned and walked out of the west wing. When she walked out of the house and saw the beautiful scenery of hundreds of flowers in full bloom, Qin Ruoying could not help but smile. Ying had always liked flowers and trees, so the courtyard had long been filled with potted plants by Chen Shi. When Chen Shi returned home, he had conveniently changed the flowering period of the plants in the courtyard, but he did not expect that it would come in handy at this moment. Even if Qin Ruoying lost her memory, this hobby did not seem to have changed. Thus, she quietly stood in front of a lily and carefully savored the faint fragrance coming from it. Until this moment, Chen Shi felt as if he had seen the lover that he was so familiar with. Ying was still Ying. She had not changed. And he had not changed either. Qin Ruoying minded her own business in the courtyard, admiring the flowers by herself. Chen Shi obediently waited by the side, feeding the fish in the fish tank from time to time. The two seemed to be strangers, but in fact there was a faint bond between the two. Just like a young couple quarreling on the street, the girl walked quickly in front, and the guy followed far behind her. Even if the passers-by did not know them, they would immediately realize the two of them should be a couple. They seemed to ignore each other, but in fact they had been ruthlessly abusing the single people on the street. Yes, this was the feeling. The strange ambiguous atmosphere did not last long. When Chen Shi noticed that someone had walked into Dongming Alley, a faint smile suddenly appeared on his face. Calculating the time, Nian should be home from school. I wonder, the moment she saw her parents, what kind of expression would she have on her face? Anyway, no matter what expression she had, that little face would definitely be very cute, right? Chapter 450. In the golden autumn of October, the smell of osmanthus wafted through the air. Whenever it was the middle of October, there would always be a sudden gust of wind in Shangjing. It seemed to indicate that the weather was about to turn cold and that everyone should wear more clothes. The bus stop sign was not at the entrance of Dongming Alley, but at a crossroad 300 meters away from the alley. After the little girl got off the bus, she immediately felt a burst of cold air rush up her back, so she couldn't help but hug her school uniform tightly. Looking at her pitiful appearance, Qin Yongyan smiled as he picked up the little fellow from the ground. Using his own inner strength, he chased away the chill in her body before quickly bringing her to the entrance of the alley. Every day they would get on and off the bus here on time. Of course, the difference between the little girl and the other children was that in addition to being picked up by her grandfather, she was always accompanied by a study companion and pet, the big cat. When they got home, Qin Yongyan would personally cook for the little girl, and the little girl would obediently return to the west wing. She would either play with the big cat for a while or watch TV for a while waiting for dinner. This was the daily routine of the grandfather and grandson pair. Usually at this time the big cat would quickly jump off the bus roof, and then slowly walk behind the grandfather and grandson pair. Similar scenes kept repeating. But the big cat's behavior today was a bit strange. As soon as it returned to the entrance of the alley, it seemed to have discovered something. After lying on the ground and sniffing a few times, it was like a dog with its tail between its legs, it jumped up the wall and onto the roof. Even Qin Yongyan didn't have time to react before the big cat's figure completely disappeared from the top of the wall. Meow. Then the big cat started to cry from the other side of the wall. But, as soon as its voice sounded, it was as if something was stuck in its neck and it suddenly stopped. Qin Yongyan felt that something was wrong. After more than a year of living together, he and the big cat were very familiar with each other, so even if the big cat only cried out softly, Qin Yongyan could roughly distinguish its thoughts based on the pitch of its voice. The big cat's cry was so strange that Qin Yongyan couldn't tell what it meant. Considering that the big cat was different from other animals, once it barked, something must have happened. Therefore, Qin Yongyan quickly carried the little fellow back to the courtyard. Wow! Grandfather! Have the flowers bloomed? It smells so good. As soon as the door was pushed open, a refreshing fragrance of flowers rushed to the tip of the little fellow's nose. Thus, she hurriedly gestured for Qin Yongyan to put her down and ran towards the Chuehua gate. It was still the circular drooping flower gate. The little fellow would walk back and forth through this door several times a day. But this time when she came to the door again, the scene behind the door became a scene that she would never forget for the rest of her life. He saw, inside this door, She was standing quietly in the middle of the courtyard, looking at her with a smile. Qin Ruoying stood in front of the potted plant in the corner of the courtyard. Although she pretended to admire the flowers as if nothing had happened, her eyes couldn't help but drift to the door of the Chuehua gate. That courtyard, that door. That flower, that person. The little fellow stood outside the door and was stunned for about 5 seconds. She didn't say anything and just looked at her with a smile. He watched as the expression on her face changed from dazed to surprised, and finally into a kind of crazy ecstasy. Daddy, 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 daddy. She opened her small hands and ran towards Qin like a spoiled child. At this time, Qin threw the big cat aside, then quickly stepped forward and hugged her tightly in his arms. The best gift was a hug after a long separation. This kind of hug didn't just come from love. It could also come from family. Daddy, I missed you so much. I missed you so much. She squatted on the ground, the little fellow buried her head deep in his shoulder, and then started to act spoiled to him in a muffled voice. She hugged her small body, and his palm unconsciously rubbed her back gently. After not seeing her for a long time, Nian had grown taller again. With just a casual glance, she knew the exact height of the little fellow. 125, 11 cm. This height was considered above average among children of the same age. According to this trend, Nian should be like her mother in the future, with a pair of straight and slender legs. Yes, definitely at the level of a supermodel. Although she had been away for more than a year, the little fellow didn't look like him at all. Instead, she was more clingy to him than before. The father and daughter were lovey-dovey for a long time. The little fellow refused to let go for a long time, as if she was afraid that if she let go, she would leave again. When the little fellow was tired of being lovey-dovey in Shi's arms, her eyes naturally drifted to Qin Ruoying. Mommy, you're awake? As she spoke, the little fellow pushed Shi away as if she wanted to run to Qin Ruoying. But at this time, Shi suddenly pulled her back. Nian, wait a minute. Mommy has just recovered and now there are still some sequelae. She can't even recognize Daddy. Just like an injured small animal, if we get too close we may scare her and then her old illness will relapse. So you'd better not go over now. Let's give her some space and let her be alone. When Mommy's illness is fully recovered, we'll go out to play as a family, okay? After hearing that Daddy did not allow her to get close to Mommy, the little fellow's mouth immediately pouted. She was still very obedient, so she immediately retracted the leg that she had stepped out. But, although she retracted her leg, her little eyes were still fixed on Qin Ruoying. That pair of big watery eyes stared at Qin Ruoying, and Qin Ruoying could not help but frown. The reason why she did not leave immediately was that everything in the courtyard gave her a familiar feeling, and she had no place to go. Even if she had lost her memory, Qin Ruoying still felt that the little girl in front of her was very familiar. This feeling was even more familiar than the one that Shi gave her. After all, Shi was only her lover. And this little fellow in front of her was a piece of flesh that had fallen from her body. Therefore, Qin Ruoying just frowned and looked at the little fellow. She stood still on the spot. The little fellow remembered Daddy's teachings, and even if she wanted to go forward, she did not dare to. This strange atmosphere lasted for a few seconds. When Shi realized that something was wrong, his mind suddenly throbbed, so he softly whispered in the little fellow's ear, Nian, why don't you go and try? Mommy doesn't know me, but maybe she knows you. Don't worry, if Mommy does anything strange, Daddy will pull you back immediately. Just like going to the zoo to see an orangutan, Shi carefully reminded the little fellow of the rules of entering the garden. However, he forgot the most important point, and that was, Qin Ruoying was already a celestial being. Therefore, if he did not use telepathy, every word that he said to the little fellow would be transmitted to Qin Ruoying's ears. As a result, Qin Ruoying silently watched the father and daughter's performance as if she was looking at an idiot. Please remember the domain name of this book, .com. Wonderful book mobile version website, .com. Chapter 451. The reunion was unexpected. I hope you've been well since we last met. Qin Ruoying heard every word of the conversation between the father and daughter. Although she had lost her memory, it didn't mean that she had lost her mind. So she was very clear about what this conversation meant. In fact, since she woke up, Qin Ruoying had been seriously thinking about everything that had happened in front of her. The reason why she was able to remain so calm and collected was simply because that was her personality to begin with. At this time, although Qin Ruoying didn't wear a sign on her face at all times like Qin Wanqing with the words, "Keep away," clearly written on it, she still gave people a feeling that it was difficult to approach her. After losing the emotional bond between her and Qin Shi, she finally showed her true self. After all, a woman couldn't just be gentle to strangers, right? This was the Qin Ruoying that Qin Shi knew at the beginning. She was a real goddess. So, she could only be admired from afar and couldn't be touched. Qin Shi didn't dare to get close to her. At this time, the little girl also found that her mother had become a little different from before. So, even with Qin Shi's encouragement behind her, the little girl still refused to take a step forward. Children were actually very sensitive. When the little girl found that her mother looked at her in a completely different way, it was as if someone had poured a bucket of cold water on her in the middle of winter. She was completely cold. It wasn't that she didn't want to, but she didn't dare. Seeing this, Qin Shi had to whisper a few words of encouragement in the little girl's ear. But after the little girl heard it, she still cowered and refused to go forward. Regarding this, Qin Shi couldn't help but have a headache. But at this time, a surprising scene suddenly appeared. Qin Ruoying, who had been motionless all this time, actually took the initiative to wave to the little girl, as if to ask her to go over. Seeing this, how could the little girl hold back? Almost instantly she took a step forward and directly pounced on Qin Ruoying. "Mother. Mother. You're finally awake. I miss you so much." As soon as he got close to Qin Ruoying, the little guy suddenly hugged her waist and buried his head in her waist, acting very coquettishly. At that moment, Qin Ruoying's body clearly stiffened. But then, she took the initiative to place her hand on the little fellow's head and gently stroked it. Qin Ruoying didn't know why he was so close to this little girl. After being hugged tightly by her, Qin Ruoying faintly felt a strange yet familiar intimacy. Could it be, am I really her mother? Thinking of this, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but turn to look at Qin Shi. At this time, Qin Shi was smiling from the bottom of his heart because of their reunion. It was fine even if he didn't laugh. This smile made Qin Ruoying's face turn cold. Chapter 452. It was night. It was a dark and windy night. Without alerting anyone, Qin Shi quietly slipped into the east wing from the guest room. After returning home this time, he actually had a lot of urgent matters to deal with. The first in line was Qin Ruoying, then the second in line was, naturally it was his sister-in-law. Qin Xueqing was lying quietly in the east wing. The furnishings in the room were almost exactly the same as 2 years ago. Under the protection of Qin Shi's restriction, not to mention thieves, even Wang Chuanju could only look at her daughter through the window. Although Qin Xueqing had a bad temper, her heart was still quite soft. She definitely belonged to the type that was tough on the outside but soft on the inside. Therefore, sometimes even Qin Shi would suddenly feel that his sister-in-law was quite cute. Therefore, even without Qin Yongyan saying anything, Qin Shi had already decided that he must wake his sister-in-law up tonight. As a result, as the brother-in-law tonight under the eyes of his wife, he sneaked into his sister-in-law's room. After all, Yingying was his lover, so Qin Shi didn't need any medium at all. He could directly find Qin Ruoying's soul among the thousands of souls. His sister-in-law didn't have this kind of spiritual bond with him, so Qin Shi needed some kind of medium to find her soul. This medium was naturally Qin Xueqing's physical body. Qin Xueqing was still wearing the white training clothes that she wore before she fainted. After Qin Shi pushed open the door and entered, the first thing that came into his sight were the two towering mountains. His wife was in the opposite room, but as the brother-in-law, he sneaked into his sister-in-law's room in the middle of the night. Although he did it to do a good deed, this kind of feeling was somewhat strange. Moreover, with Qin Shi's cultivation, what difference did it make if his sister-in-law wore clothes in front of him? Of course, Qin Shi was not a lecherous and wretched person, so he immediately withdrew his divine sense, then closed his eyes and came to Qin Xueqing's side. Qin Shi sat down beside his sister-in-law with his legs crossed and placed the soul mirror flat on her forehead before sending his consciousness into it again. As the saying goes, unfamiliar the first time, familiar the second. With the previous 2 experiences under his belt, Qin Shi was already very familiar with the process of entering the soul mirror again. It was still that space of consciousness. But this time, however, the space of consciousness that Qin Shi saw was different from the last time. Instead, it was like before the chaos was formed. The dim aurora and the green nether river were gone. All that was left were thousands of unconscious souls drifting about in the chaos. After Qin Shi arrived, the thousands of Yin souls immediately fled in all directions as if they were avoiding the god of plague. Seeing this, Qin Shi did not have any suspicions. After he poured his inner yuan into Qin Xueqing's body, a glimmer of light appeared between Qin Xueqing's eyebrows. Then a wisp of Yin soul flew out from the thousands of Yin souls, then went straight to Qin Shi's side and began to circle around his soul. Qin Shi observed carefully, and after confirming that this wisp of Yin soul had Qin Xueqing's aura, he wrapped it with his own soul and brought it out of the soul mirror. After Qin Shi released this wisp of Yin soul, it directly disappeared into Qin Xueqing's forehead. Then Qin Xueqing's eyelids trembled slightly. Seeing this, Qin Shi did not show any joy on his face. Instead, he suddenly frowned, because he realized that the entire process was unbelievably smooth. It was different from when he was searching for Ying Ying's soul. This time, it felt as if the soul mirror had taken the initiative to return Qin Xueqing's soul to him. How could Qin Shi not find this strange? After all, the soul mirror was a Kane treasure. Qin Shi would not be surprised if an artifact spirit was born from it. At this thought, Qin Shi immediately held the soul mirror in his hand and began to seriously think about everything he saw in the soul mirror. Why was it so easy to find his sister-in-law's soul after he spent so much effort to find a part of Ying Ying's soul? Also, what was the situation with the Nether River? Why did Ying Ying's soul appear at the end of the Nether River? Previously, he had been anxious to find Qin Ruoying's soul, so Qin Shi did not pay too much attention to these details. He thought that these images were just projections of his consciousness. Qin Ruoying was very important to him. After this thought was projected into his consciousness, it naturally made sense that Qin Ruoying's soul was at the end of the Nether River. But the problem was, the soul mirror wasn't his magic treasure. How could it be affected by his consciousness and place Ying Ying's soul at the end of the Nether River? Moreover, when he brought out Qin Ruoying's soul, the resistance was so great that Ying Ying lost a part of her soul. So why was it so easy and smooth when he brought out his sister-in-law's soul? The more Qin Shi thought about it, the more he felt that something was wrong. Abnormal things in the world were strange. This was just too strange. How many more secrets was this broken mirror hiding? At this thought, Qin Shi prepared to let his soul out of his body again and explore the soul mirror. However, right at this moment, Qin Xueqing suddenly opened her eyes. The soul state was unconscious, so Qin Xueqing's memory was still stuck at the time before she fell into a coma. Therefore, when she opened her eyes and saw Qin Shi sitting by her bed, Qin Xueqing was stunned. Qin Shi was so focused on the soul mirror that he did not notice that Qin Xueqing had woken up. Although Qin Xueqing was almost 30 years old, she was still an unmarried virgin. She had never even held hands with anyone. It was already the middle of the night. How could Qin Xueqing not be shocked when a man like Qin Shi suddenly appeared by her bed? Brother-in-law sneaked into her room? How was she going to face people in the future? Her sister-in-law had a bad temper. After being provoked, he went berserk on the spot and directly kicked at Qin Shi's waist. This kick, she had used 120% of her strength. After all, Qin Xueqing had already stepped into the heavenly man stage and was a genuine golden core stage cultivator. At such a close distance, plus the fact that Qin Shi was completely unguarded. Therefore, by the time Qin Shi reacted, her leg had already kicked Qin Shi's waist. Crack! With a muffled sound, her sister-in-law's right leg was immediately fractured. Then her entire body was thrown away by Qin Shi's protective chi like a rag doll that had been casually thrown away. If Qin Shi had not used his true essence to catch her in time, Qin Xueqing would have crashed through several walls before falling to the ground. Hey, that... Qin Shi tried to explain, but Qin Xueqing did not give him a chance to explain. Instead, she pointed at the door and shouted, "Get out! Get out of here!" Okay, don't be agitated, I'll go out now. He had clearly come to do a good deed, but in the end, he was like a thief who had been caught red-handed. In this regard, Qin Shi could only helplessly shake his head and then run out of the east wing like he was escaping. It was bad enough to be misunderstood by his sister-in-law. Who would have thought? As soon as Qin Shi walked out of the east wing, he met Qin Ruoying's cold gaze head-on. How sharp were the eyes and ears of a heavenly man. As soon as Qin Xueqing made a sound, she had already gotten up to check on the situation. After seeing Qin Shi come out, Qin Ruoying did not say a word. After a bang sound, she closed the door and went back to the room to comfort the little fellow who had just woken up. Qin Shi stood in the courtyard with a helpless expression. He looked left and right at the east wing, then at the west wing only to feel a chill in his heart. This was great. The yellow mud had really fallen into his crotch. Even if it was not sh*t, it was sh*t. Then, Qin gloomily set up a soundproof restriction in the courtyard. Please remember the domain name of this book. .com. Wonderful book mobile version website. .com. Chapter 453. There were 8 immortal arts. Pills, talismans, weapon formations, and witchcraft. They were pills, talismans, weapon refinement, formations, casting, witchcraft, and puppetry. The first 4 were more commonly used. Basically, every orthodox cultivator would gradually learn and master them as they cultivated. The last 4, on the other hand, weren't all that impressive, so only those with crooked paths would focus on them. No one was perfect, including Qin. In online gaming terms, Qin was a top laner who focused on head-on combat. Although he knew a little bit of miscellaneous skills, they were merely summoner skills. When it came to weapon refinement, alchemy, formations, and so on, the support healer was clearly the true professional. Hence, Qin's head hurt. The heaven-bearing efficacious floating mirror was a Khanate peerless treasure. Qin didn't know much about Khanate peerless treasures. It was said that only tribulation ascension cultivators who'd undergone the baptism of heavenly tribulations could refine their own personal treasures with the Khanate true essence in their bodies. Only then could they truly refine a Khanate peerless treasure. From this, one could see just how rare Khanate peerless treasures were. It was for this reason that Qin, who'd only been in the soul formation stage, didn't have the right to come into contact with a Khanate peerless treasure. Of course, even if Qin had obtained a Khanate peerless treasure by chance, that didn't mean he could use it for himself. The logic was actually quite simple. It was like a poor bastard suddenly obtaining the keys to a Ferrari. He probably wouldn't even know how to start the engine after getting in. There were many types of treasures. Judging from how the soul mirror had been activated a few times, it was most likely a support-type treasure. Support-type treasures were usually refined for specific situations and weren't very practical. Hence, after the Grand Pure Divine Ancestor passed away, the soul mirror had been placed in the Imperial Hall to collect dust. The soul mirror was far beyond what Qin could grasp. Hence, he couldn't find the correct way to activate it after flipping the mirror over and over again for an entire night. Speaking of which, it was strange. After Qin brought out his sister-in-law's soul, the soul mirror suddenly shut down like a phone with no battery. After that, no matter how hard he tried, he was unable to let his spirit enter it again. It was as if the soul mirror had been reduced to an ordinary item, and the space of his consciousness had been completely shut off. He couldn't very well try to break open the soul mirror, could he? Magic treasures needed to be recharged. Soul mirror had created a white hole to engulf a large world, then forcibly reversed the orbits of the 9 planets, thereby expending a lot of energy. Was that why it needed some time to recover? Qin pondered for a long time before coming to such a conclusion. Only then did he feel slightly relieved. Heaven and earth can bear witness. He really didn't want to use this opportunity to spend a few more days with the amnesiac Ying so that he could have a change of taste. The next morning, following the loud and clear cry of the rooster next door, the little fellow slowly woke up from her sleep. She didn't know what happened last night, but she was keenly aware that her mother didn't give her father a good look during the meal. As such, the smart little fellow wisely kept her mouth shut and put on her little backpack after breakfast. Perhaps it was because his sister-in-law was too embarrassed to see anyone after the farce last night, so she left the courtyard in the middle of the night, and no one knew where she was now. Qin wanted to explain the situation to her, but he saw that she was being very unapproachable, so he wisely disappeared from her sight. His sister-in-law had left, but Qin Ruoying was still there. Thus, Qin made his way to the west wing and politely knocked on the door before yelling into the room, "Nyin, let's go. Daddy will take you to school today." The little fellow immediately ran out of the room after hearing Qin's call. As soon as she stepped out of the door, she spread open her arms as if asking Qin to carry her. After Qin picked her up from the ground, the little fellow turned her head and coyly asked into the room, "Mommy, aren't you taking me to school?" The room was quiet, and Qin Ruoying didn't seem to have any intention of replying. The father and daughter waited for a while and couldn't help but look at each other. Thus, the little fellow whispered into Qin's ear, "Daddy, did you make Mommy angry?" "How would I dare?" Qin smiled bitterly and shook his head. Hearing this, the little fellow's big eyes immediately started to spin. "Daddy, do you want me to help you coax Mommy out?" This little fellow was so mischievous she actually used the word coax. After Qin heard this, he immediately put her back on the ground. The father and daughter looked at each other tacitly. After that, the little fellow seemed to have received some kind of order, and quickly ran back into the room. "Mommy, take me to school. Let's take the bus, it's fun. You haven't been to my school yet. The teacher said she wants to see you. Come on, come on." No matter how the little fellow acted coquettishly, Qin Ruoying didn't reply. In fact, since she woke up, she hadn't said more than 10 words. She was like an observer from outer space, coldly watching everything that happened around her. She only listened but didn't speak. She didn't speak, nor did she chase the little fellow away. The little fellow grabbed her hand tightly, shaking her head and wagging her tail, constantly acting coquettishly. Finally, Qin Ruoying seemed to be convinced. As soon as she stood up, the little fellow began to drag her out with all her might. Of course, if she didn't want to go out, how could the little fellow pull her? Qin Ruoying did go out, but she still didn't give Qin a good look. She didn't even look at Qin as if such a big person didn't exist. Therefore, the little fellow held her father's left hand and her mother's right hand, like a bridge between the two. Time to go to school. The sun shines in the sky, the flowers smile at me. The little bird says good morning. Why do you carry explosives on your back? Like the most ordinary family of 3, the little fellow pulled the couple onto the bus to school. Qin and Qin Ruoying didn't speak on the way, but the little fellow seemed to have been injected with stimulants, chattering non-stop along the way, even disturbing the passengers on the side. After Qin apologized to the nearby passengers in a low voice, he didn't stop the little fellow from continuing, but motioned for her to speak softly and slowly. Dad was listening carefully. Big things like arguing with others, small things like who borrowed her eraser. The little fellow chattered non-stop, and Qin listened with interest. And at this time, after getting on the bus, Qin Ruoying, who had been looking out of the window, finally looked like a sculpture that came to life. She turned her head, her eyes paused on Qin's face for a second, and then completely focused on the little fellow, looking at Nyan's little face that had turned red with excitement. At that moment, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but reach out and pinch her little face. Chapter 454. Qin Ruoying's subconscious affectionate actions were naturally seen by Qin. Therefore, Qin immediately put on a calm and collected expression, as if to imply that he did not see anything. There were many types of amnesia. The most common situation was not being able to recognize one's loved ones. However, they could still speak, write, draw, and have the ability to take care of themselves in daily life. Therefore, amnesia did not mean that one had lost their intelligence. And it was precisely because Qin Ruoying had lost her memory that everything was so new and strange to her. She was very clear about the meaning of the word mother, but she did not dislike the little fellow calling her mother left and right. Every time she heard the little fellow call her mother, she instinctively wanted to respond. If it was not for the special reserved nature of women stopping her, Qin Ruoying would have already held the little fellow in her arms and caressed him. Of course, Qin Ruoying could accept the little fellow, but it did not mean that she could accept Qin. Women always had to be a little guarded against men. The kind of woman who would completely fall into a man's good intentions could only play the role of a victim in a relationship. The one who cannot get is in an uproar, the one who is favored is fearless. No matter where it was, this sentence was absolutely regarded as the supreme truth. Therefore, even though Qin had already stepped into the insightful emptiness realm, he was still deeply immersed in it, and even somewhat enjoyed it. The capital-affiliated primary school was not far from Hohai, about 7 or 8 stops away. After the family of 3 got off the car, the little fellow, like other children, held his father in one hand and his mother in the other, and skipped towards the school gate. Although the school was chosen by Qin, this was the first time he came, so he could not help but use his divine sense to carefully scan the school. And overall it was not bad, at least he did not find any filth hidden under the sanctimonious surface. The management of a primary school was not as loose as a kindergarten, so Qin and Qin Ruoying could not even enter the school gate, and could only stand at the school gate and say goodbye to the little fellow. Dad, goodbye. Mom, goodbye. I will listen to teacher obediently. Remember to pick me up after school. Perhaps it was because Qin and Qin Ruoying were sending Nyan to school for the first time, and because the couple was too good-looking, even the guards at the entrance couldn't help but take a few more glances at them. Nyan was the most popular person in the class. Therefore, after many parents sent their children to school, they could not help but stand at the side and whisper to each other. Is that child the one who dared to hit someone on the first day of reporting? Yes, he's in the same class as our Yang Yang. He's very handsome, but his temper is too bad. He doesn't look like a girl at all. I don't know how his family educated him. Didn't you say you were going to fire her last time? Why are you still here? Expelled? Don't joke around. She's the class monitor now. She got full marks in the first half of the exam. Every parent-teacher meeting she'll be singled out for praise. Oh? This little girl is so powerful? How is she powerful? Isn't it because her family is powerful? At this point, a trace of displeasure flashed across the parent's face. Then, with a look of disdain, she said, I heard that her family has an education system. They're different from us commoners. Her performance in school directly affects the evaluation of the school. How can a child like this not be powerful? I see. She quietly listened to the conversation from the side. It was because Nianyan's performance in school was too outstanding that these parents began to suspect that the school had given Nianyan special treatment. If one thought about it carefully, this kind of narrow-minded thinking could be understood. Every parent wanted their child to be outstanding and stand out from the crowd. Any child who was able to enter the capital-affiliated primary school had at least gone through several rounds of screening. Basically, it could be concluded that they were good seedlings that far surpassed their peers. But it was a pity that excellence was always measured by comparison. Compared to Nianyan, even the smartest and most outstanding child could only be reduced to ordinary in the end. After all, when it came to comparing fathers, no one could compare to her. When he left the last time, She was worried that he would take a long time to come back, so he took the initiative to remove the first layer of seal on Nianyan's body. It was also from then on that Nianyan gradually became different from other children. Although Nianyan didn't know how to cultivate, she had already found a sense of qi when she was 5 years old. This innate affinity for spirit energy was something that many people didn't have. This was the so-called talent that was bestowed to her by God. Others couldn't be envious of it. She had been gone for more than a year, and Nianyan had also been washed by the tide of spirit energy in the courtyard for more than a year. She was still young, so she couldn't see anything for the time being. But if she continued to develop at this speed, it was estimated that it wouldn't be long before Nianyan would be able to skip a grade. Skip from 1st grade to 3rd grade, 3rd grade to 6th grade. Skip from 1st grade to 3rd grade, and directly enter university in 1st grade. At that time, she probably wouldn't be an adult and would have graduated from university. Could it be, in the future, would he have to send Nianyan to the junior class of the Chinese Academy of Science? She was still seriously thinking about whether to put the seal back. After Qin Ruoying saw Nianyan's figure disappear, she turned around and walked out along the street. Seeing this, she had to temporarily put this problem to the back of his mind, and then quickly followed. Hey Yingying, where are you going? This time, there was no little guy in the middle to act as a bridge, so she didn't dare to follow too closely. Seeing that he was so self-conscious, Qin Ruoying let him be. As a result, the couple who were incomparably loving in the past were now like a couple who quarreled and broke up. One in front and one behind, they were silent and walked aimlessly on the street. Well, in addition to taking care of Nianyan's daily life, she also had to pay attention to not let his wife get lost at all times. Back to the cloud-piercing shuttle that accidentally broke into the Tianshu ruins. This cloud-piercing shuttle was not simple. Its source of power was completely dependent on spirit stones. As long as there were enough spirit stones, it could even cross the entire Milky Way. Earth was about 6 billion kilometers away from the Oort Nebula. Even if it flew at the speed of light, it would take nearly 6 hours to reach it. Although the cloud-piercing shuttle's flying speed did not exceed the speed of light, it could perform short-distance space jumps. And this was the embodiment of the true meaning of the word void that Dongshu stage cultivators used. Chonghua and Yiji. Just like that, the two daring youths piloted the cloud-piercing shuttle towards the direction of the sun. Along the way they discovered many planets, from Pluto to Neptune, then to Saturn and Jupiter. Although these planets were large in size, they were all dead planets. So even though the two of them kept stopping along the way, they quickly arrived at Mars. After Chonghua drove the cloud-piercing shuttle around Mars, an aqua-blue planet came into view. Yiji was the first to discover that this planet was different from the rest. The planet's environment directly affected its color, so under normal circumstances, one only needed to look at the color of the planet to determine if it was suitable for habitation. Earth was aqua-blue, like a sparkling and translucent sapphire. It was very beautiful. But the most eye-catching thing about it was the spirit qi of heaven and earth that kept flowing out. This was a sacred cultivation ground? Yiji was stunned. After being stunned for a long while, he excitedly pulled on Chenghua's sleeve and shouted, "Chenghua, look, there's spirit chi on that planet. Please remember the domain name of this book." 9 Heavens Divine Emperor Mobile Version Website. Chapter 455. Not every planet could nurture life, and not every planet could produce heaven and earth spirit chi. Therefore, planets like Earth that could nurture life and produce heaven and earth spirit chi at the same time were usually extremely rare. Cultivators would call such an existence a holy land for cultivation. The important thing to mention here was, although it could be called a holy land for cultivation as long as it met the above two conditions, the holy land for cultivation did not necessarily refer to a single planet. Even if it was just a void crack in the universe or a continent formed after a planet shattered, as long as it could nurture life and produce heaven and earth spirit chi at the same time, it could be called a holy land for cultivation. Because of the effect of gravity, all the planets in the universe were spherical. It was impossible for there to be a situation where the sky was round and the earth was round like in ancient myths. If there was, then this holy land for cultivation would definitely not be a celestial body that existed naturally, but something forcefully created by a high-level cultivator with supreme magic power. For example, a strange existence like a great world. Earth was really too beautiful. It was a natural product from the chaotic universe. How could man-made things compare to it? The Supreme Palace enclosure sounded very powerful, right? It was actually just a continental plate floating in the universe. Enclosure read, Yuan as in broken walls and ruins. Chenghua and Yi had grown up in the Supreme Palace enclosure. Even though they would explore other planets when they had nothing to do, looking for life planets for fun, they had never found a true planet-level holy land for cultivation. The universe was really too big. If the Supreme Palace enclosure was a grape, then Earth, which was much bigger than it, was an apple. A bright red apple. Therefore, the two youths were like Columbus who had discovered a new continent. They were so excited that they could not control themselves. The Dubhe Ruins. It really was the Dubhe Ruins. Since it could be called a ruin, then the cultivation heritage on this planet had probably been cut off a long time ago. And didn't this mean that they could create their own heritage here and take the Dubhe Ruins for themselves? Let's go and take a look. After hearing Yi's words, Chenghua carefully sized up the planet. After he confirmed that there were no defensive formations on it, Chenghua could no longer contain his excitement. He drove the cloud-piercing shuttle and rushed over. Wait, we haven't confirmed if there's any danger up there. If we barge in rashly like this, we won't be able to deal with any danger with our current cultivation. So I think we should inform our family first and wait for them to send reinforcements. As he spoke, Yi took out a voice transmission spirit talisman. Seeing this, Chenghua couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. Then he pretended to be indifferent and replied, "Well, okay. Wait a moment, I'll activate the talisman now." Chenghua actually took advantage of the time when he was distracted, and snatched the talisman from his hand and fiercely tore it into pieces. Chenghua's actions angered Yi. Just as he was about to teach Chenghua a lesson, Chenghua completely ignored him. Instead, he directly made the cloud-piercing shuttle perform a space leap. Whoosh! Yi felt his vision blur. When he could see his surroundings clearly again, he realized that he was already in the orbit of the moon. The blue planet was not far in front of him. Because they were so close, Yi could even see the mountains and rivers on the ground with his naked eyes. Seeing this, Yi was not happy. Instead, he was angry. He hurriedly turned his head and realized that the high-grade spirit stone at the front of the ship had lost its luster. This was a sign that the spirit stone had been used up. Their cultivation levels were too low, so they could only rely on the spirit stone to drive the cloud-piercing shuttle. If they were flying normally, it would be fine. There was no resistance in the universe, so the consumption would be very low. But if they performed a space leap, every space leap was equivalent to the full-strength attack of a Dongshu stage cultivator. Thus, even a high-grade spirit stone of exceptional quality could not support the cloud-piercing shuttle to perform space leaps frequently. The two of them had only brought a total of 2 upper-grade spirit stones with them this time. Now that they had wasted one, how could Yi not feel distressed? Are you crazy? You want to jump such a short distance? Once the spirit stone is used up, what are we going to do? Don't tell me you really want to fly back slowly? Yi looked as if he expected better from him. Chenghua, on the other hand, smiled cheekily and did not seem to mind. Their cultivations were on par with each other, so it was impossible for Yi to take him down easily. Tell me, what exactly do you want? Seeing Yi's impatient expression, Chenghua knew that he was really angry this time. Thus, Chenghua immediately put away his cheeky smile and said to Yi in an extremely serious tone, Yi, have you heard of an old saying? Life and death are up to fate. Riches and honor are found in danger. Since the two of you can obtain this opportunity, why should we be so cautious and overcautious? You and I are both bastards in our families. We are not well liked. Once the news gets out, we will not be able to eat meat and soup. Hearing this, Yi could not help but interrupt him. He said anxiously, do you really think this heavenly pivot ruins is a good place? There might be some great danger lurking within. With the cultivation of the two of us. Whether it is dangerous or not, we will know once we explore. Chenghua did not wait for Yi to finish and interrupted him decisively. He had already made his decision. So no matter how much Yi objected, Chenghua had to go and explore today. Yi wanted stability. Chenghua wanted danger. This was the first time the two of them had such a huge difference in opinion. Chenghua stiffened his neck and refused to budge. Seeing this, Yi could only sigh and compromise. Fine, I am afraid of you. I will listen to you, but you must remember, the moment we discover anything wrong, we must leave this place immediately. I do not want to be buried with you. His anger was real and so was his friendship. Seeing Chenghua so determined, Yi could only let him be. All right, don't worry, I may be brave but I am not stupid. Moreover, we still have the cloud-piercing shuttle. Even if we encounter danger, we can easily retreat. Chenghua blinked and began to pilot the cloud-piercing shuttle towards Earth. Please remember the domain name of this book. 9 Heavens Divine Emperor Mobile Version website. Chapter 456. Which places on Earth had the densest spiritual energy? If one were to look abroad, then Europe's Vatican, the Middle East Jerusalem, Spain's Santiago, India's Lee Garden, and Nepal's Kathmandu were all places with extremely abundant spiritual energy. As the saying goes, rain and dew are all touched. Earth was so big, so naturally, it was impossible for all the spiritual energy to be concentrated in Wuxia. Therefore, under the constant baptism of the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, many legacies similar to cultivators appeared abroad, such as the onmyoges and ninjas of Japan, the knights, sorcerers and vampires of Europe, the pharaohs and mummies of Egypt, as well as the black magic and voodoo of South Asia. These legacies seem to be varied, but in essence, they were not much different from the legacies of the orthodox cultivators. And this seemed to coincide with the old saying, the great Tao flowed like mercury and every grain was round. However, perhaps it was because they had only appeared for a short time, so most of the cultivation legacies abroad had not formed a complete system. If they were compared to primitive people who had just entered the Stone Age, then the cultivation legacy represented by Qin was obviously a high-level cosmic civilization that could freely travel the stars. The difference between the two was no less than the difference between heaven and earth. It was precisely because of this that Qin guessed that the ancient cultivators represented by the Taiqing divine ancestor might have come to earth from a cultivation holy land. Otherwise, how could one explain the existence of Tiandu? The recovery of spiritual energy was a very long process. Just like when it was exhausted, the whole process might last 10 years, 100 years or even 1,000 years. However, even if the spiritual energy of heaven and earth on earth had not reached its peak, just based on the current situation, Earth was already very suitable for cultivators to live and reproduce here. In the eyes of Chenghua and Yi, Earth was like a new continent that had not been discovered by Columbus. The environment here was good and resources were abundant. The only bad thing was, it was probably the indigenous people who had a population of 7 billion. There were indeed too many people. Moreover, most of them had poor aptitudes and were not worth absorbing. Even if they captured these people and brought them back to do hard labor, Chenghua would feel that it was a waste of food. The two of them quietly landed on Earth on the cloud-piercing shuttle. The place where they landed, it was none other than Yellowstone Park, where Qin had refined the Adumbra flower. The spirit qi in this place was surging, and some of the medicinal power left behind by Qin when he was refining pills could be faintly felt. Therefore, Yellowstone Park naturally became the first stop of their trip. If I remember the name correctly, this should be a low-level technological civilization? Chenghua steered the cloud-piercing shuttle through the skies of the United States. Occasionally he would lower his head to look at the buildings below. Naturally, the buildings on Earth were extremely strange to the two of them. Although Cheng Hua was young, he could be considered to be experienced and knowledgeable. Therefore, he recognized at a glance that Earth's development was a little off track. The once glorious Tianshu ruins, how could they have been reduced to a mediocre technological civilization? One had to know that technological civilizations were usually born on planets without spiritual energy. The Tianshu ruins clearly had the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, so why did the development of Earth's civilization deviate? In this regard, although Cheng Hua was somewhat puzzled, he was more pleasantly surprised in his heart. Along the way, he did not detect any signs of true origin fluctuations on anyone, so he could basically be sure that this was a cultivation holy land without any immortal cultivator's inheritance. And what did this mean? It meant that even if he was only at the golden core stage, he could do whatever he wanted here without any fear. When he thought of this, Cheng Hua was suddenly very excited. He could not help but want to remove his aura concealment technique and directly descend on Earth as if he was the king of the world. Seeing this, Yi was still able to remain sober for the time being. Don't get excited, let's find out the truth first. Even if it's a low-level technological civilization, there should be some kind of weapon that can threaten us. The two of us are new here, so it's better not to be too ostentatious. After all, to these natives, we're guests from the boundless starry sky. Yi seemed to be advising Cheng Hua to be careful. In reality, even he could not help but feel a little arrogant at this moment. After all, the two of them were only teenagers. If they were not arrogant when they were young, why would they enter the world? Of course, being arrogant was one thing, but for the sake of caution, Yi still suggested that they capture one of the natives to understand the situation. Okay, we'll do as you say. I'll go capture one of them and ask about the situation. After saying that, without waiting for Yi to reply, Cheng Hua could no longer suppress the excitement in his heart. He actually jumped out of the cloud-piercing shuttle just like that. One had to know that the two of them were now in a small town not far from Yellowstone Park. This was a tourist town. There were not many residents, only about 1,000 or so. After Cheng Hua jumped out of the cloud-piercing shuttle, he flew straight to the market in the center of the town like Superman. He did not hide his figure anymore. Instead, he deliberately grabbed an unlucky young man in front of everyone in the market. Warning. This is a cultivator from Wuxia. His strength is far beyond X level. Was strange. Although Cheng Hua came from outside the solar system, he still had a standard Asian appearance. Moreover, he was different from the emaciated and sallow Asians in Southeast Asia. Therefore, the United States military recognized him as a Wuxia person almost immediately. A celestial from Wuxia. Why did he suddenly come to the United States to cause trouble? One should know that there were many unwritten rules in this world. One of them was, existences above peak strength usually did not step out of the country. The reason was very simple. Once a peak strength grandmaster left the country, the United States people would use all kinds of methods to capture these grandmasters who were close to superpowers for experiments. They wanted to perfect their exoskeleton armor through science and achieve the goal of mass-producing peak strength grandmasters. Japan was the little brother of the United States people. Moreover, the Yinyang Liao controlled almost all the practitioners in Japan. Therefore, the United States people rarely captured Yinyang masters for experiments. Wuxia and Japan were different. There were too many rogue practitioners in Wuxia. There were simply too many existences like Sunwen. Therefore, they became the main source of experimental materials. Although martial artists and necromancers had combat strength far beyond ordinary people, they were still too weak to fight against the state machine. You know martial arts, I know science. Even peak-strength martial artists knew how to cherish their lives. How could a celestial easily provoke the United States? Other than Qin Shi, no one would want to test the power of a nuclear bomb. X level was very powerful and rare. The United States people had been coveting this level for a long time. They just could not find suitable experimental materials. Therefore, when the Pentagon confirmed that Cheng Hua was at least X level, the senior military officials present were collectively excited. As long as they captured this X level, the bottleneck of exoskeleton armor technology would be able to achieve a breakthrough. God bless the United States. Chapter 458. Ever since the end of the Second War of Independence, the United States had never been baptized by the flames of war. It could not be helped. After all, the United States was the only superpower in the world today. Their tyrannical military strength gave the United States great confidence. Therefore, they had always been the ones to behave atrociously in other people's territory. Now, how could they tolerate others to behave atrociously in their territory? Therefore, the moment the Special Operations Team was destroyed, the Department of Homeland Security and the National Guard had already organized and sent a large group of people to the front line. The American Army needed to gather, but Cheng Hua did not need to. While he was waiting for the other party's reinforcements to arrive, Cheng Hua was so bored that he started to wander around the town's market. About 20 minutes later, the first batch of National Guard arrived at the scene. The American Army first alienated the local townspeople through the broadcast. Then they started to persuade Cheng Hua to surrender. At this time, Cheng Hua could already understand English. However, he ignored all these words and did not take them to heart at all. It was just a low-level technological civilization. Could they really hurt him? Cheng Hua had already seen the power of the 5.56mm bullet. This kind of attack that was like scratching and itch also caused Cheng Hua's judgment of the threat of the Tianshu ruins to drop by several levels. Therefore, Cheng Hua could not help but feel a little arrogant. He even hoped that the other party could give him a little surprise. However, he did not expect that this surprise would come so quickly. Cheng Hua had greatly underestimated the lethality of a technological civilization. Therefore, he did not prepare any defense at all. After waiting for the townspeople to evacuate and there was no response after 3 rounds of shouting, the American Army officially launched an attack on Cheng Hua. Swoosh! Following a loud and ear-piercing sonic boom, an anti-tank missile hit the shop Cheng Hua was in. The surrounding shops also instantly turned into a sea of fire in this explosion. The bullet could not penetrate Cheng Hua's protective chi, but the anti-tank missile was different. In his carelessness, Cheng Hua was sent flying by the anti-tank missile. If it weren't for the fact that he still had a defensive magic treasure on him, he was afraid that he would have suffered heavy injuries on the spot because of this. The dust raised by the collapse of the house made Cheng Hua look a little dusty. After a brief moment of shock, Cheng Hua was completely enraged. How infuriating! This was the first time Cheng Hua had been so angry. On one hand, it was because he had almost been injured by the missile. On the other hand, it was because Yi was lying on the cloud-piercing shuttle and laughing at him. Cheng Hua could not tolerate losing face in front of Yi, so he immediately flew out from the ruins of the shop. Then he suddenly pulled out a 3-foot-long sword box from his sleeve and threw it into the air. Speaking of which, it was strange. After this sword box was thrown into the air by Cheng Hua, it actually floated quietly in the air. When the battle command saw that Cheng Hua flew into the air again as if nothing had happened, they decisively ordered the soldiers to launch another attack. This time, the American Army was not trying to test the waters, so they launched a round of artillery fire. In an instant, countless poisonous stingers, battle axes, bumblebees and other sophisticated missiles that were made with a lot of money were crazily thrown at the town where Cheng Hua was. Seeing this, Cheng Hua had a murderous look in his eyes. He could not help but grit his teeth and shouted coldly, "You're asking for death." Before he finished speaking, the sword box that Cheng Hua had thrown into the air before seemed to have received some instructions. A secret door suddenly opened on the top of the box, and then countless small metal swords suddenly shot out from it. These small metal swords were like a school of fish at the bottom of the sea. After they came out of the sword box, the small metal swords started to swim flexibly in the air. Although the missile's flying speed was fast, the small metal swords were obviously faster. Bang! 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 It was accompanied by a series of explosions. The American Army's round of artillery fire was actually blocked by the small metal swords just like that. At that moment, almost everyone in the battle command at the back was shocked by this strange scene. Is this the strength of a Super X level? Is this still a human? After the small metal swords intercepted the missiles in the sky, they did not stop because of this. Instead, they continued to fly toward the location where the American Army was. These small metal swords were only about 10 centimeters long. Logically speaking, the sword box should not be able to hold many of them. However, what was strange was, from the moment Cheng Hua activated the sword box, there was an endless stream of small metal swords flying out of it, and they did not stop for even a moment. Therefore, in just a short while, the sky of the town was even covered by the small metal swords released from the sword box. The densely packed small metal swords rushed toward the location where the American Army was like a swarm of locusts passing through. When had the ordinary soldiers ever seen such a strange scene? Therefore, they were frightened by the overwhelming number of small metal swords on the spot, and they fired their guns randomly. The muzzles of the guns spat out tongues of fire crazily. The bullets hit the small metal swords, and instantly there was a series of ding-ding-dang-dang sounds of metal colliding. However, it was a pity. In the end, these actions were futile. The small metal swords quickly rushed into the American Army's armored battle group. It did not matter whether it was the drivers hiding in the armored vehicles or the fully armed soldiers. In front of the small metal swords, human lives were as cheap as grass. A light cut would instantly cause a large number of them to fall. In less than 5 minutes, this rapid reaction force of 3,000 people had been completely wiped off the face of the earth by Changhua. Fresh blood stained the ground red. The vast grassland that was bustling with noise and excitement earlier seemed to have turned into a mass grave 10 miles away at that moment. Even from afar, one could smell the thick stench of blood in the air. Such indiscriminate killing. Changhua, I'm afraid you're going to suffer retribution in the future. Iji looked at the battlefield below and could not help but frown deeply. He really did not expect that Changhua was actually so vicious and merciless. Looking at the situation, Changhua did not seem to treat these golden-haired natives as humans at all. The scene had already been broadcasted through the satellite and was clearly presented on the big screen of the battle command at the rear. At this moment, the entire battle command was silent. Almost everyone was stunned by the tragic and bloody scene in front of them. Nuclear bomb. Request to use nuclear bomb. After coming back to his senses, the supreme commander of this battle seemed to have gone mad as he frantically requested the military headquarters to use nuclear bomb. However, what no one expected was, the military headquarters actually rejected his request very decisively. The Yellowstone Park supervolcano is in an active period. Once the nuclear bomb is used, it is very likely to cause the supervolcano to erupt accidentally. The moment he heard this reason, the colonel despaired. However, what he did not know was, when the military headquarters rejected his use of nuclear bomb, they also submitted another request to the White House. The use of nuclear bomb is restricted. The military situation is urgent. Please inform Wuxia and ask Wu Lian to urgently dispatch X-level military support to us. Therefore, the United States was not considering whether or not they could take down Changhua. Instead, they were considering the price they would have to pay to take down Changhua. If he really wanted to take Changhua by force, let's not talk about whether he could successfully take him down. Once the war started, the United States would definitely suffer a lot of economic losses. Don't damaged tanks need to be repaired? Doesn't a destroyed town need to be repaired? Don't the people who have been affected by the war need the state to step in and provide subsidies? Behind each bullet was a brand new US dollar bill. Behind every soldier who died in battle, there was also a thick stack of compensation money. This was all money. Did they really think that the United States wouldn't know how to settle scores? It wasn't that they didn't know what to do with Changhua. They just wanted to solve this problem in a simpler way. Changhua wasn't a grinning alien. At first glance, they could basically confirm that he was from Wuxia. Since he was an esper from Wuxia, then naturally Wuxia should step in and take him away. The decision made by the military actually meant that they had given up on this great opportunity to capture an X-level esper alive. Thinking about it carefully, it really did hurt a little. Changhua didn't know what the United States were thinking. After destroying this rapid response team, he put away the sword case and leisurely returned to the small town's market. He wasn't in a hurry. After beating up the naughty kid, wouldn't it give him time to go back and find his father? Thus, he began to wander around the market without a care in the world. There was a convenience store in the market. Changhua picked up a piece of chocolate and tore open the packaging. After thinking that it was some kind of food, he decisively put it into his mouth. What is this? Why is it so delicious? Iji, I found something good. Come down and try it. In the Taiwei enclosure, where industrial development was almost non-existent, there were no such delicious snacks. Therefore, this bite also completely opened the door to a new world for Changhua. French fries, biscuits, candy, cheese, beef, ice cream. The convenience store wasn't big, but it had everything. Changhua ate enthusiastically, but he didn't forget to ask his companions to come down and eat together. This was a major victory for technological civilization. Even if it was a treasure of heaven and earth, it couldn't compare to the small piece of chocolate in Chenghua's hand. As a result, the two youths from outer space were completely captivated by the temptation of junk food. The drone sent by the military had been secretly monitoring the two of them. Changhua had already noticed the presence of the drone. However, while chewing gum, he swaggered into a nearby bar without any intention of shooting it down. He was waiting. The United States was also waiting. Chapter 460. There was no doubt about it. This extremely beautiful and cold woman who came all the way from Wuxia was obviously Qin Shueqing, who had just woken up from her coma a few days ago. With such a beautiful and capable daughter, Wang Chuanju and Qin Yongwang really benefited a lot from her. As a result, the couple's status in the Wu Lian had been rising steadily in recent years. Qin Shueqing was in charge of external affairs, while Qin Yongwang and his wife were in charge of internal affairs. The family had become a giant within the Wu Lian. And this was without taking into account the mysterious foreign aide, Mr. Chen. Wuxia attached great importance to the United States' request for help this time, so after the Wu Lian received the news, they immediately began to strictly select the candidates for the battle. Qin Shueqing was not the only X-level in the Wu Lian, nor was she the strongest X-level. However, she was the only X-level who took the initiative to apply for the battle. No one knew if Qin Shueqing had eaten gunpowder recently, but after returning to the headquarters in Shangjing, she had a cold face all day long. In addition, she had disappeared for more than a year, so when she came back this time, not many people dared to talk to her. Perhaps it was because of some kind of violence gene hidden in her bones, so after she saw the battle video from the United States, this woman who looked forward to going on a mission all day suddenly couldn't sit still. Before the higher-ups even made a formal decision, Qin Shueqing had already gone to the airport to prepare for departure. Not everyone was as violent as her, and not everyone liked to use war to support war. Since Qin Shueqing wanted to do this kind of thankless task, no one would jump out to compete with her. So, Qin Shueqing set off. Although the enemy in the battle video looked to be only 15 or 16 years old, Qin Shueqing didn't underestimate the enemy at all. Instead, she adjusted her state of mind along the way, hoping to be in the best state to face this mysterious celestial being. This was also the first time she had officially fought someone since breaking through to the celestial being level. Qin Shueqing soon arrived above the town that the colonel had mentioned. Her arrival naturally alarmed the two youths who were drinking in the town's bar. Then, with a beer bottle in one hand and a chocolate in the other, Cheng Hua swaggered out of the bar. As soon as he stepped out of the bar, Cheng Hua saw this strange woman with a cold and arrogant face. Qin Shueqing quietly floated above the market. Cheng Hua stood casually at the entrance of the bar. He raised his head slightly and looked at her. Cheng Hua sized up the woman in front of him. Qin Shueqing was also sizing up the young man in front of him. The two stared at each other for a few seconds before Cheng Hua seemed to have thought of something. Chapter 461. How ferocious would a battle between Golden Core stage cultivators be? Qin Shueqing didn't have any magic treasures. Her hands and feet were her most powerful weapons. Although Shi had taught her some pretty good techniques, Qin Shueqing didn't have any intention of learning more about them. She was a martial Dao grandmaster. Even though she had become a diviner, Qin Shueqing was still constantly tempering her martial arts attainments. The highest realm of martial arts was oneness of heaven and man. Oneness of heaven and man was the end of the martial Dao. Qin Shueqing had already reached the end. There was no road ahead. If there was still a path ahead of them, then this path was obviously the immortal road. Shi had already taught Qin Shueqing the cultivation method. However, due to Qin Shueqing's cold and arrogant temperament, Shi rarely gave her guidance. He would only check on her situation from time to time. As long as there weren't any major problems, Shi didn't bother to stick his hot face to her cold butt. Shi hadn't carefully studied his sister-in-law's situation, so he hadn't discovered it. Qin Shueqing had actually already walked on a different road. The sea was boundless, the sky was the shore, and the mountain was the peak. Immortal cultivation methods were indeed very powerful. There was a world of difference between them and mortal martial arts. However, until today, Qin Shueqing was still very stubborn. She still believed that the martial Dao she had been pursuing all her life had no end. She was a martial Dao grandmaster. After achieving oneness of heaven and man, she was still constantly polishing her martial arts attainments through immortal cultivation methods. Since there was no road ahead, she would walk on a brand new road. Cultivators focused on the cultivation of the soul. Qin Shueqing wanted to do the opposite and focus on the cultivation of the physical body. With this unique cultivation method, who knew what she could do in the future? The reason why Qin Shi could easily flatten her was that the gap between their realms was too big. If the two of them were put on the same level, would this brother-in-law be able to beat his sister-in-law? This has become a big problem. Qin Shi had never seriously fought with Qin Shueqing, and Qin Shueqing had never seriously fought with a cultivator of the same realm. Therefore, after seeing Cheng Hua make a slight move, Qin Shueqing immediately used all of her strength. Like a fierce tiger pouncing on its prey, she viciously pounced on Cheng Hua. Like a scholar encountering a soldier, Qin Shueqing's gorgeous and smooth series of attacks stunned Cheng Hua on the spot. He wanted to counterattack, but Qin Shueqing's hands always easily bypassed his defense and easily hit his protective shield. Cultivators rarely experience such a tangled fight. If it weren't for the fact that Cheng Hua had a defensive magic treasure on him, which reduced the majority of Qin Shueqing's strength, Cheng Hua would have been slapped into the ground by Qin Shueqing. Cheng Hua. Yi watched anxiously from the side. He wanted to help, but the two of them were too close. He was afraid that he would accidentally hurt his companion, so Yi didn't dare to rashly make a move. However, Cheng Hua wasn't stupid. After dozens of palms, he finally found a gap. At the cost of taking a palm from Qin Shueqing, he successfully shook off Qin Shueqing's entanglement. This time, Cheng Hua finally learned to be smart. When he saw that Qin Shueqing still wanted to go forward, he darted back to Yi's side and hurriedly took out his sword case from his Sumeru mustard seed bag. Cheng Hua, be careful. This woman's technique is very strange. It seems like she likes to fight in close quarters. As he said that, Yi also took out his magic treasure. Hearing that, Cheng Hua's face was full of anger and hatred as he said, I know. I almost fell into her trap just now. Don't interfere first. Let me deal with her. Cheng Hua's magic treasure was the sword case in his hand. The case was 3 feet long and yellow all over. The tail was inlaid with a group of charred black ornaments, so it was called Phoenix Perch Scorched Tail. It was a 9th grade spirit treasure and was really rare. Once the Phoenix Perch Scorched Tail case was in his hand, the battle flames in Cheng Hua's heart immediately burned fiercely. Don't look at how Qin Shueqing's palm technique made him unable to fight back at all. In reality, Cheng Hua didn't suffer any substantial damage at all. After all, Qin Shueqing's current moves were figured out by herself. Now that she was still at the stage of deliberation, how powerful could they be? It was like a boorish man with nothing but brute strength. So even if Qin Shueqing had an extraordinary accumulation of vital essence, she still couldn't fully utilize the power of this vital essence. After a bout of fruitless fighting, Qin Shueqing clearly understood her disadvantage. Therefore, she didn't want to give Cheng Hua any chance to catch his breath and directly rushed over again. But this time, Cheng Hua, who was already prepared, directly threw out the sword case in his hand. Different from Qin Shi's all swords in one, the small metal swords in the Phoenix Perch Scorched Tail case were all real objects. Each of the small metal swords could freely attack under the guidance of Cheng Hua's divine telekinesis. The sword case was the mother sword and the small swords were the child swords. The child swords were kept in the mother sword and constantly nourished, while the small swords were infinite. And this was the so-called hidden swords in the case. Of course, with Cheng Hua's current cultivation, he actually couldn't control all the child swords in the sword case as he wished. But this was already enough. At Cheng Hua's command, countless small metal swords instantly flew out of the Phoenix Perch Scorched Tail case. These small swords were like crows, covering half the sky the moment they appeared. Seeing this, Qin Shueqing was calm and unafraid. Although she didn't have any Dharma treasures, her martial intent was already above that of ordinary Dharma treasures. Afraid before the battle? Impossible. Forever impossible. If she was afraid, then she wouldn't be her. Qin Shueqing poured all the vital essence in her body into her limbs and bones, and her body instantly became as hard as iron. Her joints moved, and her whole body immediately emitted bursts of thunder. And this was the performance of martial arts cultivation at the peak, bones and tendons piercing tiger leopard thunder. And as Qin Shueqing punched out, an ear-piercing sound suddenly rang in the air. Streams of vital essence visible to the naked eye were like tornadoes, instantly knocking away all the small metal swords in front of her. Facing the sky full of sword rain, Qin Shueqing angrily went against the flow. At this moment, she was like an unsheathed sword. She actually tore a crack in the sky full of sword rain. Still barehanded at this time, Are you here to die? Seeing that she still didn't take out her Dharma treasures under such circumstances, Cheng-Hua instantly made a judgment in his heart. Tianshu ruins, as expected, it still declined. The woman in front of him with a decent cultivation but an ordinary cultivation method was probably the only powerhouse in the Tianshu ruins that could be taken out. Otherwise, how could she not be able to take out even a suitable magical artifact? Thinking of this, Cheng-Hua couldn't help but have a fierce look in his eyes. He immediately clasped his hands in front of his chest, and then quickly formed a hand seal. Please remember the domain name of this book. 9 Heavens Divine Emperor Mobile Version Reading Website. Chapter 462. At that moment, thousands of small swords seemed to have turned into a huge dragon made of metal blades. Countless sharp blades shone with cold light under the sun. The densely packed small metal swords covered most of the sky. Under Cheng-Hua's command, these small metal swords were like obedient fish. They gathered together, and the tip of the sword was pointed at Qin Wanqing, who was charging towards him at high speed. Seeing the flying swords like rain, Qin Xueqing was not afraid at all. She brazenly faced them with her bare hands. Warriors did not need weapons because their bodies were the most powerful weapons. Qin Xueqing infused her vital essence into her limbs and bones, so that a layer of faint light appeared on her originally slightly white skin. From a distance, she was like a bodhisattva carefully carved out of cold jade. It was exactly like the old saying in books, skin of ice, bones of jade, makeup of jade. Do not fear the angry eyes of the bodhisattva. Although Qin Xueqing's momentum was strong, but it was a pity that her exploration of martial arts was still at the beginning stage. Now, with only her mortal body, how could she resist Cheng-Hua's phoenix perch scorchtail box? Countless small metal swords kept hitting Qin Xueqing's protective shield. At first, Qin Wanqing could still rely on the quintessential essence in her body to repel the small swords. However, as wave after wave of flying swords continued to attack, Qin Wanqing's protective shield couldn't help but begin to weaken. Soon, a small metal sword successfully pierced through her protective shield. Qin Xueqing could not dodge in time. This small sword immediately left a shallow wound on her face. This was just the beginning. As soon as the protective shield was broken, the small metal swords swarmed up like crazy bees. Seeing this, Qin Xueqing decisively abandoned her own defense. At the price of sacrificing the protective shield, she instantly increased her speed by a lot. Of course, the result of this was obvious. Countless small wounds suddenly appeared on Qin Xueqing's body. Cheng-Hua had been deliberately keeping a distance from Qin Xueqing. Every time Qin Xueqing took a step forward, he would decisively take a step back. Seeing Qin Xueqing suddenly accelerate, Cheng-Hua didn't react in time, and Qin Xueqing successfully closed in on him. Bitch, do you really think I'm afraid of you? Cheng-Hua was also quite experienced in facing enemies. Seeing that Qin Xueqing was too strong, he didn't panic at all. A fierce look flashed in his eyes, and then he suddenly pulled out a 3-feet-long sword from the phoenix perch scorchtail case. This was the primordial sword and also one of the most important parts of the phoenix perch scorchtail case. Very few people knew about the existence of the primordial sword. Ever since Cheng-Hua obtained the phoenix perch scorchtail box, he had been using it as a killing move. Cheng-Hua had always been arrogant because of his talent, and his heart was higher than the sky. How could he tolerate Qin Wanqing chasing after him like a dog? Today he was also forced into a corner by Qin Xueqing. Therefore, Cheng-Hua no longer retreated. After pulling out the primordial sword, he slashed at Qin Xueqing, who was swinging her palm at him. In the rain of swords, Qin Xueqing was about to attack. Cheng-Hua pulled out his sword to meet her. Bam! With a loud sound, the vital essence caused by the collision of the two instantly tore the small town below into ruins. Yi nervously waited at the side, so he clearly saw the entire process of the two fighting. Therefore, as soon as the two separated, Yi hurriedly rushed to Cheng-Hua's side. Cheng-Hua, are you okay? I'm fine. Cheng-Hua gloomily wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and said coldly, I almost fell into this B****'s trap again. In the moment when they exchanged blows, Qin Xueqing suddenly changed her move. Her left hand pressed against the long sword and her palm hit the spine of the sword, trying to knock the long sword out of Cheng-Hua's hand. At the same time, she immediately raised her other hand and slapped Cheng-Hua's chest. Cheng-Hua had taken the full brunt of this palm, so even now, he could still feel his blood and qi churning in his body. It's nothing serious, don't worry. Yi wanted to heal Chunghua, but Chunghua shook his head and refused. Then he lowered his head to look at the ruins below. That D*M&B*T. Wasn't she lying in the ruins of the small town, covered in blood? Although she had successfully injured Chunghua with her reckless fighting style, she had also paid a heavy price for it. Speaking of which, Qin Xueqing was once again at a disadvantage because she didn't have a magic treasure. She hadn't expected. Chunghua's true killing move wasn't the twin sword in his hand, but the Phoenix Perch Scorched Tail box beside him. The Phoenix Perch Scorched Tail box was refined by a Dongshu cultivator. It didn't look big, but it contained nearly 10,000 small metal swords. With Chunghua's cultivation he could only use a third of them. The rest of the sub-swords were all hidden in the sword box. Although Chunghua couldn't control the remaining sub-swords normally, he could still detonate the Phoenix Perch Scorched Tail box and release all the sub-swords in the box in an instant. Just like the principle of a fragmentation grenade, once the Phoenix Perch Scorched Tail box exploded, it would not only set off a powerful shockwave, but also release countless sub-swords to increase the destructive power of the explosion. A 9th grade spirit treasure could explode just like that. Chunghua had really put in a lot of effort this time. But then again, a 9th grade spirit treasure in exchange for the life of a golden core cultivator. This seemed to be a good deal? Division Chief Qin. Division Chief Qin? Are you okay? Therefore, as the class monitor, she led her classmates to stand under the national flag and made a declaration to join the team. At the same time, she stood on the podium with the same batch of young pioneers and sang the Young Pioneer song. We are the successors of communism. Inherit the glorious tradition of our revolutionary forefathers. Love the motherland, love the people. A bright red scarf fluttering in front of our chests. Needless to say, from then on, the way her classmates looked at her was a little different. Perhaps it was because Nian had hit someone when she first entered the school, so the children in the class were a little afraid of her. After she became a young pioneer and wore a bright red scarf, her classmates were no longer so afraid of her. Instead, they became very respectful of her. Although she was the class monitor, she never tattled to the teacher. Because even the most mischievous of classmates didn't dare to jump in front of her. Nian almost became the leader of the class. Whenever her classmates went overboard during class or made loud noises during self-study, she only needed to glare fiercely at them, and the students she stared at would instantly wilt like eggplants that had been hit by frost. All of these behaviors were seen by the teacher, who didn't like outstanding children. Although Nian was only a first-grade student, by the time she reached the second grade, the title of 3 good students was basically guaranteed. Nian was so worry-free, so she naturally didn't have to worry too much. Therefore, as the child grew up day by day, he, as the father, became more and more free. On this day, she sent Nian to school as usual. When he was about to leave, he happened to meet Nian's class teacher. The teacher pulled him aside and praised him, which almost made she burst out laughing. Ying, did you hear that? Every teacher is praising our Nian. This child is really becoming more and more sensible. After parting with the teacher, she was still very proud of himself. Qin Ruoying walked quickly in front, and he bragged about his daughter's excellence behind her. There was a detail here that was worth noting. In the past, she could only hang about 10 meters behind Qin Ruoying. He didn't expect that after a few days he would be able to stick to Qin Ruoying's 2 to 3 meters behind her. Qin Ruoying's attitude towards him didn't seem to change much, but the distance between the two was constantly closing. Therefore he successfully climbed onto Ying's bed. This became Qin's main goal at the moment. In order to achieve this goal as soon as possible, Qin worked hard. And the little sweetness that constantly emerged in the process of this struggle was really not worth mentioning to outsiders.